Welcome back. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little tighter, and just let your mind drift. Tonight, we are doing something a little different. No battles, no urgency, just 3 hours of random Pokémon facts, quietly delivered, one after another, like rain on a window. Stories you never knew. Details so tiny they almost disappeared. Moments from the history of the biggest franchise on Earth, most of which never made it into any headline. So close your eyes when you are ready and let the world of Pokémon wash over you. Section 1. The Origin Story. How Pokémon Came from Nothing. There is a suburb of Tokyo called Machida, and in the late 1960s it was still half countryside. Streams wound through rice paddies. Forests of cedar pressed close to the backs of family homes. Boys in rubber boots would spend whole mornings turning over stones in shallow creek beds, cataloging what they found. One of those boys was named Satoshi Tajiri, and he was completely and utterly obsessed with insects. He called himself Dr. Bug. Not in a self-aggrandizing way, the way a child might make up a superhero name. It was just what his friends called him because when it came to the beetles, the dragonflies, the moths, the stag beetles in their armored shells, Satoshi genuinely knew more about them than anyone in his neighborhood. He knew where to find the rare ones. He knew what they ate. He could identify species from memory. He had a whole system for organizing his collection, and it gave him a kind of quiet, focused joy that few other things could. Then the city ate the fields. It happened over the course of a few years in the 1970s when Japan's economic miracle turned Machida from a patchwork of agriculture and wilderness into another suburb of concrete, department stores, and parking lots. The ponds were drained, the forests were leveled, the places where the insects lived simply stopped existing one by one, and the collection Satoshi had so carefully built became a kind of archive of something that was gone. He found a new obsession to fill the silence: arcade games. The late 1970s were exactly the right moment for a boy with Satoshi's temperament to encounter them. Space Invaders had just exploded in Japan, and arcades were everywhere, and they had a quality that reminded Satoshi of his old hobby in a strange, abstract way. They rewarded the kind of sustained, systematic attention he had given to entomology. The owner of his local arcade liked Satoshi enough that he once gave him an actual Space Invaders cabinet as a gift. That is the kind of impression this kid made on people. By his teens, Satoshi was not just playing games, but dissecting them, writing about them, trying to understand what made one game special and another forgettable. In 1983, when he was 17 years old, he began publishing a handwritten, hand-stapled fanzine about arcade games. He called it Game Freak, the name borrowed from a 1932 film he had seen that fascinated him. He wrote it himself and sold copies through specialty shops and at gaming events. It was, by any reasonable measure, a little artifact, a photocopied magazine from a teenager in suburban Tokyo. But it was something else, too. It was the beginning of everything. Ken Sugimori was an aspiring manga artist who found a copy of Game Freak in a shop and liked it enough to reach out to Satoshi directly. He became the magazine's illustrator, and then its creative partner, and then one of Satoshi's closest friends. The two of them shared a similar way of seeing things, a similar attention to detail, a similar feeling that the games being made at the time could be better than they were. Through the magazine, Satoshi also connected with Tsunekazu Ishihara, a businessman who produced game-related programming for Fuji Television. These three relationships, Tajiri and Sugimori and Ishihara, would eventually build the most valuable media franchise in human history. But not easily, and not quickly. In 1989, Satoshi officially incorporated Game Freak as a development company, hiring a small team of friends and enthusiasts who had contributed to the fanzine. One of those contributors was a composer named Junichi Masuda, who had answered an ad Satoshi had placed, looking for someone who could write music for games. Masuda was not a professional programmer. None of them were, really. They had learned by doing, by purchasing development kits and studying hardware documentation and simply putting in the time. The first game they shipped, a puzzle title called Quinty, or Mendel Palace as it was known in America, was published by Namco in 1989. It worked. It sold decently. It proved they could finish something. Satoshi had been thinking about Pokémon for most of that decade. The seed of it planted itself somewhere around 1990, when he watched two children connecting their Game Boys with a link cable in a train car. The Game Boy link cable was a simple piece of technology, a wire that ran between two consoles and allowed them to trade data. Satoshi looked at it and saw something that no one else had seen. He saw insects crawling down a wire. He saw his childhood. He saw the fundamental human pleasure of finding something and sharing it, of having something that someone else wanted, of making a connection through the exchange of something living. The game he imagined in that moment was called Capsule Monsters, which later became Pocket Monsters, which later became Pokémon. The core of it was always the same. You went out into the world, you found creatures, you collected them and raised them and traded them with other people. It was bug collecting. It was insect journals and rubber boots in shallow streams. It was everything Machida had taken away from him, translated into something that could live inside a cartridge. He pitched it to Nintendo. They did not exactly say no, but they also did not exactly say yes, and there followed a development process that stretched across 6 full years. 6 years is a long time, long enough for people to give up, long enough for the dream to curdle into resentment, long enough for 5 separate employees to resign from Game Freak because they could not see the end of the tunnel. Satoshi did not take a salary for much of this time. He lived off income his father provided. Creatures Inc., a small company that would become one of Pokemon's co-owners, stepped in at a critical moment with investment money that let Game Freak finish the project. Had that money not come through, there simply would have been no Pokemon. The game shipped in Japan on February 27, 1996, as Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green for the original Game Boy, a piece of hardware that was already aging out. Nintendo's newest system was the Super Famicom. The Game Boy was already years old, and nobody expected major hits from it anymore. The games sold slowly at first. Not badly, but not spectacularly. 100,000 copies, then another 100,000, gradually building through word of mouth among children who discovered they could not stop playing them. And then someone found Mew, not by design exactly, and not through any trick or cheat code. A programmer at Game Freak named Shigeki Morimoto had slipped Mew into the game just 2 weeks before it shipped, buried in a memory slot that the game's other data had left empty. He did it partly as a technical exercise and partly as a kind of gift to the players, a secret reward for the most devoted explorers. Almost no one at Nintendo knew Mew was in the game. The word spread through schools and trading posts and gaming magazines, growing with each retelling until catching Mew became the thing every Pokémon player wanted to do. The mystery drove sales. The mystery turned a slow-burn success story into something that Nintendo had not seen coming. By the time Pokémon Red and Blue launched in North America in September 1998, it had already become a franchise. The anime was on television. The trading card game was selling out of print. The movies were being planned. Satoshi Tajiri, who had spent his teenage years hand-stapling fanzines in his bedroom, was now presiding over one of the strangest and most enormous cultural phenomena in the history of media. He has spoken very little about all of this publicly. He gives almost no interviews. He does not attend fan events. He directs no games anymore, having handed the reins to Junichi Masuda after Ruby and Sapphire, and now serves as an executive overseer. The man who built the entire thing out of his own nostalgia for muddy creek beds lives very quietly in the world he made. His name, Satoshi, became the Japanese name for the franchise's main character. His mentor's name, Shigeru, became the name of his rival. He put himself and his admiration for Miyamoto directly into the fiction, without fanfare, without announcement. Just a quiet, private joke tucked inside a thing that 300 million people would eventually play. There is one more detail about Satoshi Tajiri that is worth knowing, because it illuminates something important about how Pokémon was designed. He made a specific, conscious decision about early in the development process that Pokémon should faint when they lost a battle, not die. In an interview, he said he believed it was important for children to understand that losing a game did not mean death. Pokémon were meant to get back up. They were meant to recover. The whole emotional architecture of the franchise, the bond between trainer and Pokémon, the idea that you kept going and kept growing was built on that single quiet value. A boy who used to collect insects in the fields of Maeda decided that in his world, the creatures would always have another chance. That is the origin of Pokémon. Not a board meeting, not a marketing strategy. A boy losing the fields he loved and spending 30 years building them back. If you are still awake and enjoying this, drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I love knowing where in the world this reaches. And if you are new here, consider subscribing so these kinds of long, slow videos find you automatically. Now back to the facts. Section 2. The secrets buried in Generation 1. Red, Blue, Green. The 3 games that started everything, released in Japan in 1996 and in North America 2 years later, were small miracles of constraint. They ran on a processor that was barely more powerful than a pocket calculator. They stored their entire worlds on cartridges with less memory than a single low-resolution photograph takes up on a modern phone. And inside that almost absurdly limited space, the developers at Game Freak packed a world so dense with hidden things that fans are still finding new details in it nearly 30 years later. Let us start with something foundational. The first Pokémon ever designed was not Pikachu. It was not Charizard. It was not Bulbasaur. It was Raiden. That big, rhino-like creature with the horn and the rough hide and the slightly combative posture was, according to the lead designer Ken Sugimori, the first fully realized Pokémon sprite that was ever coded into the game. This is why, if you pay close attention while exploring Kanto in the original games, you will find that statues in Pokémon gyms all look like Raiden. They are not decorative. They are a tribute, embedded quietly into the environments by developers who wanted to honor the creature that came first. But there's a distinction worth drawing. Raiden was the first Pokémon coded. The first Pokémon sketched in Sugimori's early design sessions was Clefairy. Long before the franchise had a mascot or a direction or even a name players would recognize, there was a little round creature with stubby arms and star-shaped ears sitting on a piece of paper in a small studio in Tokyo. Pikachu came much later. The original plan, in fact, was for Clefairy to be the franchise's central character. The first Pokémon manga released in Japan, Pokémon Pocket Monsters, featured a protagonist whose main partner was a foul-mouthed, aggressive, deeply irreverent Clefairy who broke the fourth wall and generally behaved nothing like the cute character fans in the West came to know. When the anime was being developed, producers seriously considered Clefairy for Ash's companion. Early storyboards show it. Test materials show it. It was only late in the pre-production process that the choice shifted to Pikachu, for 2 reasons. Electric powers made for more visually exciting battles, and audience testing showed that Pikachu's round yellow design appealed equally to boys and girls, which Clefairy's pink did not. One decision in a conference room, one piece of market research, and the most recognizable face in franchise history was settled. Pikachu's own design has its own hidden story. The character was designed by Atsuko Nishida, and the cheek pouches, those little circles of pink that sit on either side of Pikachu's face and have become among the most recognizable shapes in all of popular culture, were added because a game designer asked Nishida to make the character cuter. She took inspiration from squirrel cheeks, the way squirrels store food and puff out. The black tips on Pikachu's ears are vestigial marks from an even earlier version of the design that looked, according to Nishida's own description, like a long piece of daifuku with ears sticking out. The evolution of the design from that blobby prototype to the icon we know happened through dozens of small iterations, each one sharpening and softening in alternating rounds until something landed that felt right. Now here's something that most people do not know about the original games. Professor Oak was supposed to be a battle opponent. Using a GameShark cheat device, players discovered that Oak had a full team of high-level Pokémon programmed into him, battle data that included team composition and movesets, all functional and complete. He was never made accessible in the normal course of play, and there's no record of exactly when or why the decision was made to remove him from the battle progression. The prevailing theory is that as development continued, the producers wanted Oak to feel purely like a guide and mentor rather than an obstacle, and so his battle data was left in the code but locked away behind an impossible trigger. It is still there in every legitimate copy of Pokémon Red and Blue, waiting. The item duplication glitch tied to Missing No is probably the most famous exploit in the history of video games, but most people who used it did not understand what they were actually interacting with. Missing No, whose full designation is missing number, was not an accident in the traditional sense. Game Freak programmed placeholder data blocks into the Pokédex structure to prevent the game from crashing whenever it tried to access entries for Pokémon that had not yet been assigned. If there was no data at a given memory address, the game would break. So they filled those addresses with dummy code, blocks that had the minimal structure of a Pokémon entry without any actual creature attached to them. When players found a way to trigger those memory addresses through the specific sequence of talking to the old man in Viridian City, flying to Cinnabar Island, and surfing up and down the eastern coast, Missing No rendered itself using whatever visual data happened to be stored nearby in memory. Different cartridges, different save states, sometimes produced slightly different-looking Missing No's. The item duplication effect came from how the game stored data in the player's inventory. When Missing No's encounter was triggered, a piece of data was overwritten in a way that happened to cause the sixth item in your bag to have its quantity register at a higher number than before. Players discovered this by accident and then figured out the specific conditions to reproduce it. And for years after, the ability to duplicate rare candies was passed around schoolyards like currency. The game was not broken by this, not permanently in most cases. But there were other glitch Pokémon in the game's code. Entities like the one simply designated M or the terrifying array of glitch creatures that lived in higher memory addresses. And some of those could cause genuine save file corruption. Missing No became famous and beloved, partly because it was, by the standards of the surrounding neighborhood, relatively harmless. There is also the focus energy glitch, which is one of the most quietly devastating programming errors in the original games. Focus energy was designed to double the critical hit rate of the user's attacks. It was supposed to be a powerful tactical move in the right situations. Instead, due to a single coding mistake in how the critical hit calculation was written, using focus energy actually divided the critical hit rate by 4 rather than multiplying it. Players who used the move were not boosting their luck. They were actively sabotaging themselves, making critical hits dramatically less likely for the remainder of the battle. Nobody figured this out for years. Players simply noticed that focus energy seemed terrible and stopped using it. The bug was not corrected until later generations. For the entirety of the first game's competitive lifespan, one of its moves simply did the opposite of what it was described as doing. The cry of Professor Oak's Nidorino in the opening cutscene is actually the cry of a Nidorina. This is not a conspiracy theory or a minor sound bleed. The wrong Pokémon audio file was assigned to that specific animation, and it shipped that way, and it remained that way through the game's original print runs. Players who knew both cries noticed immediately, but for most of the world, who were encountering Pokémon for the first time and had no frame of reference for what a Nidorino was supposed to sound like, it was completely invisible. You could also fish for Magikarp inside the Raiden statues in Pokémon gyms. Using an old rod on any Raiden statue would trigger a fishing encounter, just as if you had cast into a body of water, and you would find a Magikarp there waiting. This was almost certainly not intended. It happened because the code that governed fishing checks looked for a specific kind of object interaction, rather than specifically checking for the presence of water, and the Raiden statues happened to register with the same interaction flag as water tiles. Nobody caught this in testing, or if they did, it was deemed so minor that it was not worth delaying the game to fix. The Safari Zone in the original Kanto region had something strange about its mechanical design that was only revealed years later when developers discussed it openly. The rock and bait throwing system was designed not because it had any elegant strategic logic behind it, but mainly because the developers wanted the catching process to feel unpredictable. They wanted it to simulate the genuine uncertainty of trying to catch a rare insect in the wild, something you could not simply force through preparation alone. The math behind it, however, turned out to be somewhat counterintuitive. Throwing bait often actually decreased the overall probability of a successful catch, and throwing rocks increased the likelihood of the Pokémon fleeing before you could throw a Pokeball. Many players spent years believing there was a hidden optimal strategy, a perfect ratio of rocks to bait, some combination that unlocked the system. There was not. The system was designed to create chaos, and it succeeded. There were originally plans for a safari zone in gold and silver as well. The data for it is still present in the code of both games. A gate building, a set of map tiles, some basic environmental features. Players who used cheat devices to access these unused areas found an empty, unfinished location without Pokémon or exit warps. The Safari Zone only returned to the Gold and Silver world in their remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, nearly a decade later. Some fans interpreted that return as a quiet acknowledgement that something had been missing, that Game Freak had known the feature was left undone and had been waiting for the right moment to complete it. There is also a Pokémon called Farfetch'd, a duck holding a leek stalk, whose name in English is a layered pun. In Japanese, the creature is called Kamonegi, which combines the word for duck, kamo, with the word for green onion, negi. It is a reference to a Japanese proverb that describes a particularly lucky situation as a duck arriving with its own green onion, because duck stew is considered delicious when prepared with green onions. And having both arrive together without effort is the kind of coincidence that feels almost too convenient. The proverb is essentially the Japanese equivalent of saying something is too good to be true. Farfetch'd's rarity, as a Pokémon that appears only in specific and limited locations, makes the name a self-referential joke. Encountering a Farfetch'd in the wild truly is somewhat far-fetched. The English localization team preserved the spirit of the pun while making it work in the context of their language, and it remains one of the most elegant naming decisions in the original 151. Wailord, which was introduced in the third generation, but is worth mentioning here in the context of scale and physics, has a body mass index of approximately 1.9. For reference, a healthy human BMI falls between 18 and 25. Wailord is listed as 47 feet long and weighing 877 pounds, which means that it is so enormous relative to its weight that physicists have calculated it would float in air rather than sink in water. It is, by the internal logic of the Pokédex's data, less dense than air. Whether this was intentional, a commentary on the physical impossibility of the world Game Freak was building, or simply an oversight in the numbers, no one has ever said. Section 3. The playground myths that built a generation. Before the internet, before instant verification, before anyone could pull out a phone and fact-check a claim in seconds, information about Pokémon traveled the way rumors have always traveled. From mouth to ear, from note passed in a classroom to note passed at lunch, from older kid to younger kid on a bus, from cousin at Christmas who had heard it from a friend who swore it was true. The early years of Pokémon generated a mythology that was completely self-sustaining, entirely without factual basis, and absolutely indistinguishable from truth if you were 10 years old and did not know better. The truck near the SS Anne is probably the most iconic of all these myths. Here is the setup. In the course of normal gameplay in Pokémon Red and Blue, you visit the SS Anne in Vermilion City, board it to retrieve an HM that lets you navigate the game world, and then watch the ship sail away as you leave. If you surfed past the dock after the ship had departed, you could see a small sprite, a truck, parked on the pier's edge. There was no functional purpose for the truck. It did not interact with anything, it simply sat there. A piece of scenery that seemed placed with intention. That seeming intention was enough. The rumor that spread was specific. If you could prevent the SS Anne from departing and then use the strength HM to move the truck, you would find Mew hiding underneath it. Children went to extraordinary lengths to test this. Some tried to skip the necessary interaction that triggered the ship's departure. Some spent hours surfing back and forth trying to get an angle that would let them push the truck. Some traded their best Pokémon to cousins who claimed to have done it, only to discover the cousins had simply used a cheat device to generate a Mew and were lying. The truck did nothing. The truck has always done nothing, but it sat in that game for the entirety of its commercial lifespan as a perfectly placed piece of ambient storytelling that players filled with their own yearning for secrets. The actual way to encounter Mew in the original games was discovered years later through careful reverse engineering of the game's memory management. The game stores encounter data in a specific memory register when a trainer spots the player and initiates a chase. If the player triggers a very specific sequence, Managing to escape a trainer's line of sight at exactly the right moment by using the teleport or fly moves, the memory register is left in a corrupted state. When a wild Pokémon encounter is later triggered in certain areas, the game loads that corrupted register and translates it into a Mew encounter. The exact sequence required a specific trainer on Route 24, a specific moment of using Fly after the trainer spotted, but before the encounter was fully initiated, a specific destination, and then a specific wild encounter trigger on Route 25. It worked. It was completely real. Mew was in the game after all, just not under the truck. There was also the widespread belief that there existed a Pokémon called Mew3, an evolved or alternate form of Mewtwo that could be unlocked through a sufficiently elaborate chain of events. Various magazines published detailed, entirely fabricated guides for obtaining it. The specifics differed from version to version, but most involved doing something unusual at Mewtwo's cave in Cerulean City, using a specific item in a specific location, or meeting a condition involving the number of Pokémon caught. Some of these hoaxes were sophisticated enough that they were printed in gaming publications that did not verify their accuracy before publishing them. The 1990s gaming press had no fact-checking protocol for user-submitted tips, and Pokémon was moving too fast for editors to personally test everything. There was also a rumored third evolution for Raichu, sometimes called Gorochu, which had its own separate trajectory of myth-making. This one turned out to be not entirely false. In interviews given years after the original games shipped, Ken Sugimori confirmed that Raichu had indeed been designed with a further evolution in mind during development. The original evolutionary line was Pichu, Pikachu, Raichu, and then one more stage. The final stage, as Sugimori described it, had fangs and would have looked more fearsome and imposing than Raichu. It was cut at some point during development, with the reasoning apparently being that the line was long enough, and that adding another evolution might dilute the attachment players were already forming with Pikachu. So the myth was real, in the sense that the evolution had existed as a concept, even if it had never existed as a catchable creature. A rumor circulated for years about a method of obtaining the 3 starter Pokémon without trading. The actual game mechanics required you to choose one of the 3 and trade with other players to get the remaining 2. The rumored methods involved specific sequences of interactions with the rival trainer or specific conversations with the scientists at Oak's lab, none of which worked. What is interesting about this myth in retrospect is that it reveals something about the player community's relationship with the game's design. People desperately wanted the collecting fantasy to be completable on their own, without depending on other players, and so they invented a solution because the emotional demand for one was so strong. The B-button catch rumor is perhaps the most universal of all Pokémon myths, and surveys of players who grew up with the series suggest that a significant majority believed it at some point. The belief was that pressing and holding the B button after throwing a Pokeball would increase the chance of catching the Pokémon inside. There were refinements. Some people said you had to hold B and down simultaneously. Some said timing it to the second or third shake of the ball made it more likely to succeed. None of this had any effect whatsoever. The catch mechanic in the original games was a purely mathematical calculation based on the Pokémon's maximum HP, its current HP, its catch rate value, and the type of Pokeball used. Button presses during the catch animation were not part of the calculation. They had never been part of the calculation. And yet the myth persisted, and persists to this day, because the system was designed in a way that made it feel like player input might matter. The ball wobbled, it clicked, sometimes it broke open at the last moment. The drama of the animation made the experience feel like something you could influence, and when you held B and it caught, you felt the confirmation of your technique. When it failed, you blamed your timing rather than acknowledging that you had never had any control to begin with. It was confirmation bias given a compelling UI, and it worked on millions of people. There was the Peekaboo rumor, which might be the most perfectly constructed false leak in gaming history. Before Pokémon Gold and Silver released internationally, information about the new generation was scarce and precious. And the rumor that spread through schoolyards was that there existed a blue Pokémon called Peekaboo, somehow connected to Pikachu, that could be unlocked through an elaborate sequence involving the original games. Peekaboo was not Marill exactly, though some believe the confusion arose from early promotional materials showing the new water-type mouse Pokémon. But the name, the specificity of it, the way it spread and mutated, generated its own self-sustaining legend that predated any official announcement. Kids believed in Pikablue the way they believed in all rumors of that era, completely, and with the particular confidence of someone who had heard it from a reliable source. The Yoshi rumor is worth mentioning for its sheer audacity. A tip published in a 1999 issue of a gaming magazine explained an elaborate process involving trading a Dratini between copies of Red and Blue, evolving it into a Dragonite, and then using a Firestone on it in Mewtwo's cave. The result, according to the tip, would be Yoshi from the Mario franchise, who would be stored in your Pokémon party as a usable creature. This was obviously false in a way that made it immediately implausible to anyone who thought about it for more than a moment. But the fact that it was printed in a magazine gave it a sheen of official credibility. Some children tried it. The Firestone did nothing to a Dragonite, and Yoshi never appeared, and the magazine printed no retraction. What is beautiful about all of these myths, in retrospect, is not that children were credulous. Children have always been credulous, and that is part of childhood. What is beautiful is that the myths themselves were evidence of how deeply people loved these games. The effort people invested in testing impossible rumors, the willingness to trade beloved Pokémon to strangers in hopes of getting closer to a secret that did not exist, the elaborate systems of verification and counter-verification that developed in school cafeterias and summer camps. All of it speaks to a community of players who were not just consuming a game, but actively dreaming inside it, building something collaborative and imaginative in the space between what the game was and what they wanted it to be. The truck near the SSN, in that reading, is not a stupid myth. It is a monument. It is the physical location of 1 million children's longing for a secret, and the fact that it still sits there in the code of a 30-year-old game, completely inert, somehow makes it more meaningful rather than less. Section 4. The Anime You Never Knew. The Pokémon anime premiered on April 1st, 1997 in Japan, about a year after the games, and it changed the franchise's trajectory in ways that could not have been predicted. Games could be copied and traded and sold secondhand. The anime was something else. It was live, it was in every home with a television. It was something that hundreds of millions of children watched at the same time, together, and it made the franchise feel enormous in a way that a handheld game simply could not. But the anime that reached global audiences was substantially different from several versions that were planned, developed, and abandoned along the way. Many of those abandoned versions are fascinating because they suggest a franchise that could easily have become something almost unrecognizable. The most famous of these is the Clefairy question. The production team spent considerable time debating whether Ash's first and primary Pokémon should be Clefairy rather than Pikachu. The argument for Clefairy was its role in the existing manga and its established popularity in Japan. The argument for Pikachu came down to two things. Testing showed it was more gender-neutral in its appeal, and the decision had already been made at the game level to position Pikachu as the mascot. But the debate was real, and late-stage storyboards exist that show early concepts for what an Ash and Clefairy pairing might have looked like. The chemistry was different. Clefairy in the manga's characterization was loud and chaotic and irreverent. A show built around that dynamic would have been a very different kind of story. There was also serious consideration during the early development of the anime of making the protagonist female. Producers at one point proposed centering the show on the female companion rather than on a male lead, with the reasoning that this would differentiate the anime from other monster-battling properties. TV network executives pushed back, arguing that a male protagonist would sell better internationally. Misty, who would have been the central character in this alternate version, was instead written as a secondary character, albeit one with enough personality and presence that she became one of the most beloved figures in the franchise's history. Brock was not supposed to stay. The original concept for the anime involved cycling through different gym leaders as temporary travel companions, letting Ash's group change composition as they moved through new regions. Brock was the first of these planned temporary companions, and his role was written as episodic rather than permanent. The writers discovered, after a few episodes, that Brock's dynamic with the group, The combination of his protective older sibling energy, his comic romantic failures, and his genuine expertise in Pokémon care was too good to discard. They rewrote the show's structure to make him a permanent fixture. This decision, made relatively casually in the first few weeks of production, defined the emotional shape of the anime for years. The Porygon episode is perhaps the most consequential 30 minutes of animation in the history of the franchise, and what most people know about it is not the full picture. The episode, titled Electric Soldier Porygon, aired on December 16, 1997, and featured a scene in which Pikachu used a thunderbolt attack to destroy a series of missiles inside a computer system. The explosion created a rapid alternating sequence of red and blue flashes. That sequence, lasting only a few seconds, triggered photosensitive epileptic responses in approximately 685 children across Japan who were watching the broadcast. They were taken to hospitals. The episode aired exactly once and has never been broadcast again anywhere in the world. The Porygon detail matters because it was not Porygon who caused the seizure-inducing effect. It was Pikachu. The flash was generated by Pikachu's attack. Porygon was simply present in the scene and had nothing to do with the visual stimulus that caused the medical incident. And yet Porygon and Porygon 2 and Porygon Z have been effectively absent from the Pokémon anime ever since. They appear in brief background cameos in very rare instances, but they have never again featured as a significant character in any episode of the main series. The creature was punished for something it did not do, sidelined indefinitely in a franchise that has continued to produce over 1,000 more episodes in the years since. There is a running joke in the Pokémon fandom, Porygon did nothing wrong, that has persisted for nearly 3 decades, and it is both funny and genuinely melancholy when you understand the actual sequence of events. The seizure episode caused Nintendo's stock to drop by 12,200 yen in the immediate aftermath. The show went on a 4-month hiatus. When it returned, the animation team had gone back through the existing episode library and dimmed or altered scenes that might pose similar risks. New rules were implemented across the entire Japanese animation industry, not legally mandated but widely adopted, about the use of flashing lights in animated content. The Pokémon anime changed how anime itself was made. There is a banned episode called The Legend of Dratini, and if you grew up watching the Western broadcast of the original series, you will never have seen it. It features the Safari Zone's warden, a character named Kaiser, and it is the episode in which Ash catches the 30 Tauros that you see in his party throughout the original series without any explanation of how they got there. The reason it was never dubbed or broadcast outside Japan is that Kaiser repeatedly points a handgun directly at Ash, at one point asking the terrified 10-year-old if he would like to die. The firearms content was considered completely incompatible with children's television standards outside Japan, and the episode was simply never localized. The absence creates a permanent plot hole in the Western broadcast that nobody ever explained. Ash just mysteriously has 30 Tauros, and the show never addresses where they came from. The episode also contained a revelation that Western fans never got to see. The Safari Zone warden owned a Dragonite. At the time of broadcast, Dragonite was one of the most powerful and mysterious Pokémon in the franchise, a creature that most players had never actually encountered, and whose visual design many had only seen in promotional materials. The moment in the episode where the warden reveals his Dragonite would have been extraordinary for Japanese viewers, and it was seen only once and never again by any official broadcast audience. The episodes involving Team Plasma, the antagonist organization from Pokémon Black and White, were scheduled to air in Japan in March 2011. A 2-part storyline, the first major confrontation between Team Rocket and Team Plasma, was set to run in the days following their scheduled broadcast slot. On March 11, 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami struck Japan, killing over 15,000 people and triggering the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The episodes were postponed out of respect. They were never rescheduled. The Tohoku earthquake was simply too devastating, too close, and too raw for a children's animation depicting catastrophic destruction and explosions to be appropriate in any near-term window. By the time that window might have reopened, the anime's continuity had moved past the point where the episodes fit, and they were eventually written out of existence. They exist as dubbed scripts and production materials, but they have never aired anywhere in the world. An episode of the Sun and Moon era, the 64th episode, was never broadcast outside Japan for a reason that is immediately apparent to anyone who describes what happens in it. Ash paints his face to resemble a Passimian, a dark-colored Pokémon, in order to blend in and play a game of American football with a group of them. The face paint, as depicted, bore a resemblance to blackface, and the episode was never dubbed and has not aired internationally. James from Team Rocket has one of the most peculiar censorship histories of any character in the anime. An early episode that was initially skipped in the United States, Beauty and the Beach, featured a scene in which James wore an inflatable bodysuit designed to simulate a female figure with exaggerated breasts which he used to compete in a beach beauty contest. He then proceeded to taunt Misty about her own figure. The episode aired in Japan without incident, was never dubbed initially, was eventually dubbed and aired twice in the United States in 2000, and was then never aired again. What makes this particularly interesting from a comparative censorship perspective is that the same episode contained a giant cannon battle that aired without any modification. The cross-dressing was cut. The weaponized mayhem was kept. What is notable about the entirety of the anime's censorship history is how much of it comes down not to any single content policy, but to the specific cultural context of the moment of broadcast. An earthquake bans one episode, a terrorist attack bans another, a racial caricature controversy bans a third, a medical incident bans a fourth. The anime has been shaped, quite literally, by the history of the world it was made in. Section 5. The Trading Card Game's Hidden History. In January 1999, Wizards of the Coast, the company responsible for Magic the Gathering, launched the English version of the Pokémon trading card game in North America. The set contained 102 cards. 16 of them were holographic. One of those holographic cards was a fire-breathing dragon whose name was Charizard, and within weeks of the set's release, that card had already become the most desired object in the elementary school economy. The set was called the First Edition Base Set, and if you want to understand why certain physical objects accumulate almost mythological significance in popular culture, it is worth studying carefully. The first edition print run was limited, and once it sold out, the same cards were reprinted without the small edition 1 stamp that sat on the lower left side of the card artwork. Those stamped first edition copies became rarer automatically, simply by being the first batch. And among them, the holographic Charizard became the rarest of the rare worth pursuing, because Charizard was already the most popular Pokémon in the games because his card had the highest HP of any card in the set, and because the artwork, Charizard breathing an enormous plume of flame against a dark background, was simply beautiful in a way that a 10-year-old's eye could immediately recognize. The first edition set had quirks that the collectors of today can use to identify its earliest print runs. The most famous of these is the Red Cheeks Pikachu. The Pikachu card in the set came in 2 variations, an early printing in which Pikachu's cheeks were colored red, and a corrected later printing in which they were colored yellow to match the official character design. The Red Cheeks Pikachu is scarcer because fewer copies were made before the correction was caught. And in the current collector market, the difference between those 2 versions can translate to a significant difference in value. The Machamp card in the first edition set has its own oddity. Every other holographic card in the set is genuinely rare. Machamp is technically stamped with the first edition symbol, but it was mass-produced as a promotional inclusion in starter decks and distributed in far larger quantities than the other holographic first edition cards. A first edition Machamp is everywhere. A first edition Chansey, by contrast, is genuinely scarce, and in gem mint condition has sold for significant amounts, partly because the holographic printing process that the base set used created a texture on the card's surface that was particularly prone to scratching. And Chansey's card has an especially large holographic area, meaning clean, well-preserved examples are rarer than any print run number alone would suggest. The Pikachu Illustrator card is in a different category entirely from every other Pokémon card ever produced. It was created in 1997 and 1998 as a prize for a Pokémon card illustration contest run by Koro Comic, a Japanese manga magazine. Children submitted original artwork inspired by Pokémon, and the winners received cards bearing the Pikachu Illustrator card. Only 41 copies of the card are believed to exist. The card does not say trainer in its type field the way all other non-Pokémon cards do. It says Illustrator. It contains a small pen icon not found on any other Pokémon card in existence. The artwork was created by Atsuko Nishida, the original designer of Pikachu, which means the card connects directly to the creature's own creative origin. In January 2021, a copy of the Pikachu Illustrator in PS. A grade 9 condition sold for $233,000, making it the most expensive Pokémon card ever sold at that time. That record lasted only months. Later that year, the only known PSA 10 copy, the single highest graded example of the rarest card in the hobby, was acquired by Logan Paul for $5,275,000, a price officially recognized by Guinness World Records as the most expensive Pokémon card transaction in history. Then, in February 2026, a PSA Gem Mint 10 copy sold at Golden Auctions for $16,492,000, a price that would have seemed like a science fiction premise to anyone who had held one of those cards in a cardboard sleeve in 1997 and thought nothing more of it. The Family Event Trophy Kangaskhan card is among the most emotionally resonant rare cards in the entire game's history. It was distributed in 1998 at a special tournament concept in Japan, in which parent and child teams competed together against other family pairs. The prize for winning was a card featuring Kangaskhan, a Pokémon whose defining visual characteristic is a baby permanently tucked into her pouch, protected and carried wherever its mother goes. The card illustrated by Ken Sugimori himself, the co-creator of the original 151. In July 2023, a PSA 10 copy sold at Heritage Auctions for $175,000. The combination of its rarity, its emotional theme, and its direct connection to the franchise's founding artist gives it a significance that goes beyond market value. The trading card game has a history of printing errors and misprints that have become their own category of collectible. Some cards from the early sets have incorrectly printed energy symbols, wrong attack names, missing flavor text, or type indicators that do not match the card's actual category. The pre-release Raichu card mentioned in certain collector circles, a card supposedly stamped with pre-release in the wrong location during a Wizards of the Coast test run, is one of the most debated misprints in the game's history. Only a handful of people have ever claimed to own one, and Wizards of the Coast gave conflicting statements about whether the cards existed as distributed items or only as internal test prints. The card has never been definitively proven or definitively disproven. It occupies a space in Pokémon history similar to the one that Bigfoot occupies in cryptozoology. Probably not real, possibly real, and specifically structured to resist definitive conclusion. The shadowless cards from the base set are a collector distinction that many casual collectors learn about only after they have already sold their childhood collections. In the very first print run of the base set, before a specific point in the production schedule, the cards were printed without a shadow effect behind the image box in the card art. The shadow, a thin line running along the right side and bottom of the image frame, was added in subsequent printings. Shadowless cards, the ones that predated the Shadow Edition, are now recognized as earlier print runs than even standard first edition cards and command their own premium in the collector market because the timeline of their production places them as the earliest commercially distributed English Pokémon cards in existence. The entire trading card game was banned in Saudi Arabia in 2000. The reasoning, as expressed in official statements at the time, involved concerns that the game promoted polytheism and gambling. The polytheism concern arose from the game's concept of multiple powerful entities, analogous in some interpretations to multiple gods, while the gambling concern was directed at the pack opening mechanic in which players spent money without knowing what they would receive. The ban meant that an entire generation of Saudi children grew up with Pokémon games and the anime, but without legal access to the card game, creating a cultural split in the franchise's presence that was quite distinct from its reception elsewhere. In Japan, the card game launched in October 1996, just 9 months after the video games, suggesting that the Pokémon Company had the trading card component planned very early in the franchise's development. The speed of that launch also reflected how quickly the video games had taken off. By October 1996, Pokémon was already a phenomenon in Japan, and the trading cards were designed to extend that phenomenon into a physical social space that the Game Boy experience could not reach. The idea of a child bringing their deck to school, trading cards at lunch, building and rebuilding their collection in real time with the people around them, captured something about the social currency of Pokémon that the link cable mechanic in the games had been designed to create but could not quite replicate alone. The number of trading cards sold by the Pokémon Company as of recent estimates has crossed 75 billion total units. To put that number in some kind of human-scale context, if you stacked all 75 billion cards on top of each other, the stack would be approximately 4.7 million kilometers tall. That is 12 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. Section 6. The Ghosts of Lavender Town. There is a place in the original Pokémon games called Lavender Town. It sits in the middle of Kanto, accessible only after the player has navigated through the rock tunnel, a cave with no illumination, no flash HM early in the game, and a series of trainer battles that are genuinely difficult for the period of the game at which they occur. Emerging from that tunnel into the daylight is a small relief, and Lavender Town waits at the other end of it, quiet and slightly wrong. Lavender Town is a cemetery. It exists in the game specifically as a place for Pokémon to be buried. The main structure in town is a tower 7 stories tall, the Pokémon Tower, and it is full of wandering spirits and possessed trainers and a ghost that the player cannot interact with or fight in the normal course of the game. That ghost is the spirit of a Marowak, a Cuboni's mother, who was killed by Team Rocket and whose anger keeps her tied to the tower. She cannot be put to rest until the player obtains a specific item, the Sylph Scope, that lets them see and interact with her. When they do, she does not fight. She simply dissipates, apparently grateful, apparently ready to move on. For a children's game about collecting and battling cute creatures, this is remarkably dark. The Marowak story is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in the original games, built without dialogue, told entirely through environmental context and item descriptions, and the simple fact of a mother's spirit standing in the way of her child's rest. Cubone's Pokédex entries compound this. The skull that Cubone wears on its head is described as belonging to its deceased mother. Early concept art for Cubone showed multiple skull designs, suggesting the developers had considered a version where each Cubone wore the skull of a different species, implying each one had lost a different kind of mother. This idea was never used, but its existence implies that the original concept was even more specifically grief-focused than what shipped. The music that plays in Lavender Town was composed by Junichi Masuda. It is built from sharp chiptune notes and slightly dissonant chord structures, and it works on a level that is difficult to explain purely in technical terms. It is not a horror soundtrack in any conventional sense. It does not use the typical tricks of horror music, the sudden changes in dynamics, the low drones, the building tension. Instead, it is simply off. It sounds like something that should be peaceful but is not quite. Like a lullaby that has been learned incorrectly and cannot be corrected. Players who encountered it at the age of 8 or 9 and had not encountered it before would sometimes feel genuinely reluctant to spend time in the town. Not because anything explicitly scary was happening, but because something about the sound made them want to move through quickly. The Lavender Town music was altered for the Western release of Pokémon Red and Blue. The original Japanese version had a slightly different tone structure, particularly in the higher frequency ranges. The alteration was real and documented. What is not real is the story that grew up around it in the early 2010s, a creepypasta that spread across internet forums under the name Lavender Town Syndrome. The story claimed that in the weeks following the original February 1996 release of the games in Japan, there had been a spike in suicides and mysterious illnesses among Japanese children between the ages of 7 and 12. The claim attributed these deaths to the Lavender Town music, specifically to high-frequency tones in the original Japanese version that were audible only to children because of the unique sensitivity of young ears to high-pitched sound. The story said that the developers became aware of what was happening, altered the music for subsequent releases, and covered the incident up. It said that the Western releases were engineered to exclude the dangerous frequencies. None of this happened. No such spike in child suicides occurred. No documentation of any such event exists in any verifiable archive. The story is a fabrication, created as a piece of internet horror fiction in 2010 and spread with extraordinary speed through communities that were primed to believe it because they had grown up associating Lavender Town with unease. The real-world medical incident involving the Porygon episode, which had genuinely caused seizures in children in 1997, gave the story a kind of ambient plausibility. Pokémon media had once hurt children, so the idea that it might have done so again was not completely disconnected from reality. But the Lavender Town story is a work of fiction. What made it spread so effectively was not just the receptive audience, it was the structural intelligence of the hoax. It placed the alleged event in Japan, where Western audiences had no direct ability to access primary sources, and where linguistic barriers made casual verification difficult. It tied itself to a real and documented alteration of the game's audio. It appealed to a very specific emotional reality. Everyone who had played Pokémon as a child and been unsettled by Lavender Town had a personal experiential anchor that made the story feel somehow confirmed rather than simply claimed. And once people started adding details, once photoshopped spectrograms appeared, showing the word "leave now" spelled in unknown letters in the audio waveform, the story became self-reinforcing. The actual Lavender Town creepypasta ecosystem is remarkably extensive. There is the Buried Alive story, which involves an unused NPC in the original games, a zombie creature that was supposedly the intended final boss of the Pokémon Tower before being replaced by the Marowak ghost. This story claims that the Buried Alive character had sprites, a full roster of Pokémon including a Gengar and 2 White Hands, and special game over screens that showed it consuming the player character. Like the Lavender Town syndrome itself, the Buried Alive story is a fabrication built on a real foundation. There are genuine unused data blocks in the Pokémon Tower's memory, and data miners have found references to characters and interactions that were removed before shipping. But the specific Buried Alive scenario, with its grotesque roster and its special endings, does not appear in any verified data mine of the game. It is fan fiction that has been presented as discovery. There is also the White Hand story, which describes a disembodied, decaying hand that was supposed to appear on the 3rd floor of the Pokémon Tower as a wild Pokémon encounter. The story is specific enough, describing 4 distinct animations for the creature, that it feels like it might be drawn from something real. No such entity has ever been found in the game's code. What Lavender Town's mythology ultimately demonstrates is something interesting about the relationship between horror fiction and places of genuine emotional charge. The cemetery existed, the music existed, genuinely unsettling. The Marowak's story existed, genuinely sad. The ghost encounters existed, genuinely creepy by the standards of what surrounded them in the game. The raw material was always there, and the internet simply furnished it with more elaborate stories, the way any sacred or haunted location accumulates narrative over time. Lavender Town did not need to have caused suicides to be one of the most memorably strange pieces of game design in the history of the medium. It was already that. But there is one real fact about Lavender Town's real-world effect that is worth dwelling on because it happened. The music that plays there, composed by a young programmer named Junichi Masuda in a small studio in Tokyo, was experienced by millions of children simultaneously during the year 1997 in Japan, and subsequently by millions more worldwide. It became one of the most widely shared musical experiences in gaming history. Those children are adults now, and when they hear it again, something specific happens. Not seizures, not suicides, not syndrome. Something smaller and stranger and more real. They feel immediately and without preparation like they're 8 years old again. standing at the entrance to a tower full of ghosts, slightly afraid to go forward and uncertain about going back. That is what the music actually does. And that is enough. Section 7. Cut content and beta Pokémon. The roads not taken. In the summer of 2018, a group of prototype enthusiasts who called themselves Team Space World released materials they had obtained from an old Nintendo server, a demo build of Pokémon Gold and Silver that had been exhibited at Nintendo's Space World trade show in 1997, 2 full years before the games shipped to retail. What they revealed was a window into an alternative Pokémon that almost happened, a Johto region and a roster of creatures so different from what players knew that it felt less like a beta version of a finished game and more like the skeleton of a different franchise entirely. The original Space World 1997 demo for Gold and Silver was built on a map that bore very little resemblance to the Johto region that shipped. The developers had initially conceived of the game as taking place across a much larger version of Japan, with areas that corresponded roughly to different regions of the actual country. The map showed dead tree areas, snowbound zones, and geographical spreads that suggested a world several times larger than what the Game Boy Color's memory could actually accommodate. By the time the games were finished, the scope had been dramatically compressed, and the resulting Johto was a more intimate, more carefully crafted world, precisely because the constraints had been so severe. The Pokémon in the demo were different in ways that still generate conversation. The water and fire starters were completely different creatures. The water starter resembled something like a Loch Ness monster, a serpentine aquatic design that bore no resemblance to Totodile's line, while the fire starter was a unique creature with no obvious connection to Cyndaquil. Chikorita and Meganium were already recognizable, but Bayleaf, the middle evolution, was different enough that its redesign must have been a deliberate decision. The beta Bayleaf looked somewhat awkward and unfinished, and it is possible to see in the final version how the designers smoothed and improved it. The demo contained an extraordinary number of baby Pokémon, many of which were cut before the final game shipped. There were baby forms for Growlithe, Vulpix, Ponyta, Grimer, and Paras, among others. Some of these baby designs were genuinely charming and have inspired fan campaigns to have them included in later generations. Ditto, in the demo, had both a pre-evolution and a post-evolution, suggesting the developers were experimenting with what Ditto's transformation ability might look like at different stages of development. Farfetch'd had an evolution in the demo that was cut, a creature whose existence prefigured Sirfetch'd by more than 2 decades. Whether the designers of Sword and Shield were inspired by the beta design, nobody has confirmed publicly. Natu and Xatu originally had a peacock-like middle evolution in the demo, a stage between the small prophetic bird and its larger 2-headed form that was cut at some point in development. Porygon 2's original design in the demo looked, in the opinion of many who saw it, like the mascot from a donut franchise, round and bright and branded in a way that seemed inconsistent with a computer program rendered in physical form. The final Porygon 2 is a more abstract, technical-looking design that feels more coherent with the original Porygon's aesthetic. There was a beta Pokémon called Kotara, a small electric tiger cub that never made it into any official game. Its sprites show a compact, cute design with stripes and the visual language of electricity around its feet. Fans still discuss whether Kotara might have inspired later electric-type Pokémon like Shinx, which introduced a lion-style electric creature in the 4th generation. Whether the connection is intentional or coincidental is unknown, but the similarity is visible. The Space World demo also contained a version of the Johto map in which the Lake of Rage and Mahogany Town lacked gyms, suggesting that at this stage of development, the 8-gym structure was not yet finalized. There were only 6 gym sites in the demo map. The addition of 2 more gyms between this early build and the final release means that significant portions of the game were still being designed after the 1997 trade show, and the Gold and Silver that was shown to the public that year was a significantly different game from the one that shipped in 1999. The leak also revealed something striking about the pre-evolutions that were planned and cut. The beta Magby looked different from the Magby that eventually appeared in the final games. Beta Pichu was larger and less rounded than the final version. Beta Celebi had a design that was frankly stranger and more alien-looking than the final creature, which was later softened into something more approachable. These differences, small as they individually are, collectively paint a picture of a design process that was still in flux very late in production, with creatures being reshaped and reconsidered up until close to the end. Beyond the gold and silver demo, data mining of the original red and blue games revealed cut content that was less dramatic but equally interesting. There was coded into the game a type called bird that was separate from flying. In the final game, all bird-type Pokémon are categorized as flying type, but the internal data still contains the bird designation as a separate classification that was never publicly activated. This suggests that very early in development, Game Freak was distinguishing between birds and other flying creatures at the type level, and then made a decision to collapse those categories before the game was finalized. In Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, data miners found unused cry files in the game's audio data that did not correspond to any known Pokémon. These are audio recordings of what appear to be Pokémon vocalizations that were never assigned to any creature, sitting in the game's memory as placeholder files for designs that may have been in development and then cut before the game shipped. The crying itself is strange and somewhat eerie to listen to, particularly because it sounds close enough to actual Pokémon cries that you keep trying to identify what creature it might belong to, and you cannot. The Altering Cave, a location in Fire Red and Leaf Green and also in Emerald, was coded with an event that was never activated. The cave was designed to have its wild Pokémon population change based on a Wonder Spot event, a distribution mechanic that would have required players to bring their cartridges to specific Nintendo-sponsored events to download new encounter data. The event was never held. In both games, Altering Cave contains only Zubat in its final, shipped form. The space it occupies in the game, a small cave with functional mechanics and interesting topography, is completely inert unless you account for the distribution event that never came. It exists in a state of permanent suspension, waiting for an event that has been not held for over 20 years. Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green contained an unused map that data miners identified as bearing a suspicious resemblance to Johto's Olivine City. This has been interpreted as evidence that at some point during development, the team was considering including a portion of Johto as post-game content in the Kanto remakes, mirroring how Kanto was included as post-game content in Gold and Silver. The map was never finished and never connected to any functional gameplay, but its presence suggests that the idea existed and was worked on to at least a preliminary stage. The actual fulfillment of this concept, a game that included both Kanto and Johto as playable regions, eventually arrived in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. The Pokémon Snap sequel, New Pokémon Snap, which finally arrived in 2021 for the Nintendo Switch, after decades of fan requests, restored several features that had been cut from the original 1999 game. One of those was customizable camera settings, the ability to use different lenses and adjust framing. Data miners had found references to these features in the original Snap's code years before New Pokémon Snap was announced, suggesting that the original team had wanted to include them and had been unable to finish the implementation. The sequel essentially completed what the original had planned and could not deliver, across a gap of more than 20 years. Section 8. Strange Design Secrets and the Hidden Language of Pokémon. Every Pokémon name is a puzzle. Some of them are obvious. Squirtle is a turtle that squirts water. Charmander is a salamander that can char things. Electrode is an electric sphere that resembles an electrode. But many of the names carry layers, references to mythology, to Japanese wordplay, to the specific cultural moment in which they were created. And learning those layers changes how you see the creatures themselves. Gyarados is a sea serpent, terrifying and enormous, the kind of creature that destroys ships and capsizes boats with the casual indifference of something that has no concept of human fear. And yet it evolves from Magikarp, which is the most helpless, most useless-seeming creature in the entire game, a fish that does nothing and knows nothing and whose only combat action is to flop weakly. The connection between them is not random, it is drawn directly from Chinese mythology. In the myth, a carp must swim upstream against powerful currents and leap over a waterfall called the Dragon Gate. If it succeeds, it transforms into a dragon. The myth is called the Koi's Ascension, and it is one of the oldest and most revered symbols in Chinese culture, representing perseverance and the transformation that comes from sustained effort against resistance. Magikarp and Gyarados are a direct translation of this myth into game mechanics. The fish that seems worthless becomes a dragon. The player who endures the tedium of raising a Magikarp is rewarded with one of the most powerful creatures in the game. The mechanic was designed to feel exactly like that myth. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, the two fighting-type Pokémon introduced in the first generation, are named after martial artists in both their Japanese and English forms, but the references are different depending on which language you are looking at. In English, Hitmonlee nods to Bruce Lee and Hitmonchan references Jackie Chan, both iconic names in Western martial arts cinema. In the original Japanese, Hitmonlee is named Sawamura, a reference to Tadashi Sawamura, a Japanese kickboxer widely credited as one of the founders of the sport. Hitmonchan is Ebiwaler in Japanese, named after Hiroyuki Ebihara, a Japanese boxer who was a world flyweight champion in the 1960s. The English localization shifted the references from Japanese sports heroes to globally recognized martial arts celebrities, preserving the intent while making it legible to a new audience. The Hitmons are a perfect case study in how localization does not just translate words but remaps cultural reference entirely. The Pokédex number relationship between Pikachu and Meowth is not accidental. Pikachu is number 25. Meowth is number 52. The reversal was intentional, placed by designers who wanted to embed the cat and mouse dynamic of the two characters into the franchise's foundational numbering system. They are mirror images of each other numerically, just as they are positioned opposite each other in the show's central dynamic. The story of Meowth learning to speak human language in the anime, specifically learning to speak because he was in love with a female Meowth who was impressed by humans, is one of the most genuinely moving pieces of Pokémon lore in any medium, and it gave the character a depth that the original scripts had not planned for. The improvised vocal delivery of the Japanese voice actress Inuko Inuyama, who brought a street-smart, rough-edged quality to Meowth that had not been written into the character, was so compelling that the writers built more and more of the show around him. Slowbro is the only Pokémon in the series who can devolve, at least in official Pokédex lore. Slowpoke becomes Slowbro when a Shelder latches onto its tail, the bite triggering a chemical reaction that elevates Slowpoke's intelligence considerably. The Pokédex notes that if the Shelder were ever to let go, Slowbro would revert to Slowpoke. This is an unusual piece of the game's internal logic, an acknowledgement that evolution in the Pokémon world is not always a one-way irreversible process, and it raises quiet philosophical questions about identity and change that the franchise has never fully pursued. Gengar and Clefable have been the subject of a fan theory for decades, one that the designers have neither confirmed nor denied. The theory holds that Gengar is, in terms of shape and silhouette, a dark mirror of Clefable. Both have round bodies, similar ear structures, and roughly analogous limb shapes. Gengar is dark purple, Clefable is light pink. Gengar is a ghost type associated with darkness and haunting. Clefable is a normal type associated with moonlight and mystery. The theory proposes that Gengar is meant to represent Clefable's shadow, the dark reflection of the same basic form, positioned as a kind of cosmic opposite. Ken Sugimori has acknowledged that the designs share structural similarities, but has been characteristically non-committal about whether the relationship was intentional. The theory remains unconfirmed and unfalsifiable, which is exactly the state many of the best fan theories prefer. The Ditto as Mew clone theory is similarly durable. Ditto is the only Pokémon that can transform into any other Pokémon. Its shiny form, its exact body weight, and its special relationship with the transform move all echo elements of Mew's design and lore. Ditto and Mew share the same base stat total of 100, an unusual figure that no other Pokémon in the first generation shared. The theory holds that Ditto is a failed clone produced during the experiments that created Mewtwo, a genetic attempt at replicating Mew that succeeded in capturing the transformation ability, but failed to produce a stable or complete creature. The theory draws on the location of Ditto's primary habitat in the original games, the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. the same location where the journal entries about Mewtwo's creation can be found. Ditto can be found throughout the Pokémon world in later games, which complicates the theory somewhat, but its prevalence in the mansion in the original game is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Sudowoodo looks like a tree and is a rock type. Its entire existence is a performance, a boulder wearing the camouflage of vegetation. The name is a portmanteau of the Latin pseudo, meaning false, and the Japanese wood. It is a rock pretending to be wood, named explicitly as a thing that lies about what it is. The gameplay interaction that reveals Sudowoodo's true nature, the fact that watering it with a squirt bottle activates it because a real tree would be neutral about water while a rock in disguise would be alarmed by it, is one of the most elegantly designed puzzle moments in the entire franchise. The game communicates the distinction between things that look like what they are and things that do not through a single interaction with a bottle of water. Mimikyu's entire design is built on pathos. This is a small, unknown Pokémon that has wrapped itself in a crudely constructed disguise made to resemble Pikachu, and the Pokédex entries explain why. Nobody ever comes to see Mimikyu. Nobody wants to meet it or be near it. So it studied the most beloved and popular Pokémon in the world and made itself look like that Pokémon, hoping that if it wore the right costume, someone would finally want to spend time with it. The disguise is bad, hand-drawn, and lumpy, and slightly wrong in proportions. The Pokédex describes the creature beneath the cloth as something that should never be seen, something so disturbing that people who have accidentally glimpsed it have suffered serious medical consequences. The combination of desperate longing for companionship and genuinely horrifying true nature is one of the most complex emotional combinations in any Pokémon's design. Yamask's Pokédex entry in Pokémon Black and White states that it carries a mask that represents its own face from when it was once alive. In other words, Yamask was a human being and has been transformed into a Pokémon and carries the face it used to wear as a ghost. The entry goes further, noting that Yamask sometimes looks at the mask and cries. This is without question one of the darkest pieces of Pokémon lore across any generation, because it directly and explicitly bridges the boundary between the human world and the Pokémon world in the direction of tragedy. A person became this creature and remembers being a person and mourns it. The fact that this is tucked into a Pokédex entry that children can scroll past without fully processing it does not diminish how extraordinary a piece of writing it is. Dryfloon, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, is described in its Pokédex entries as a balloon-like Pokémon that forms from the spirits of humans and Pokémon who died without fulfilling their wishes. The entry notes that Dryfloon appears in front of children and invites them to take hold of its string, and that when a child grabs the string, Dryfloon attempts to carry them away. Whether away means into the sky or into some other dimension or toward death is left deliberately ambiguous. The entry horrified parents when the game's released, because it described, in the most candy-colored and adorable packaging imaginable, a creature that preys specifically on children. The legendary bird Lugia, the counterpart to Ho-Oh in the second generation, is a psychic and flying type that, by all rights, should be in the sky. But Lugia does not live in the sky. It lives in the deepest ocean trenches it can find. The Pokédex explains that Lugia's wings are so powerful and uncontrollable that a single flap can generate storms that last for 40 days, and that Lugia, because it does not want to cause this destruction, chose to exile itself to the bottom of the sea where its wings could not accidentally harm anyone. Lugia is a creature of enormous power that has chosen restraint over expression, isolation over influence, because it understands its own potential for unintended harm. It is a quiet piece of mythology that most players absorb without articulating, but it gives Lugia a kind of melancholy depth that the more combat-focused legendary designs do not possess. The Swords of Justice, the legendary quartet introduced in Black and White consisting of Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo, were designed as a direct reference to the French novel The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Cobalion corresponds to Athos, the eldest and most stoic of the group. The group's formation as a protective force for Pokémon who have been harmed by humans mirrors the novel's themes of loyalty and principled action. This was the first time that Western literary source material had been used as an explicit design basis for a legendary group in the mainline games. And the choice of Dumas specifically suggested something about the cultural broadening of Game Freak's reference palette in the 5th generation. Section 9. The most controversial moments in Pokémon history. Every franchise that reaches Pokémon's scale will, over time, collide with the world's complications. Cultural sensitivities shift. Real disasters make certain imagery unbearable. The mechanics of a global media empire mean that decisions made for one audience will land differently in another. And the same content that is perfectly normal in one cultural context is deeply offensive in another. Pokémon has navigated more of these collisions than almost any franchise of its era, and the history of those navigations tells you something about how the world changed between 1996 and the present. The Jynx controversy is probably the most documented of these moments. Jynx is a humanoid ice and psychic-type Pokémon that was introduced in the 1st generation, with a design featuring long blonde hair, an exaggerated red mouth, and a dark black complexion. In 2002, cultural critic Carol Boston Weatherford wrote an essay arguing that Jynx's design bore a troubling resemblance to blackface, the racist caricature tradition in which white performers would darken their faces and exaggerate their features to mock black people. The comparison was not merely superficial. The specific combination of features, dark skin, large exaggerated lips, oversized proportions, drew on a visual vocabulary that had been used specifically to demean black people. Nintendo and the Pokémon Company took the criticism seriously. Jynx's skin color was changed to purple in subsequent game releases and anime appearances, a change visible in the comparison between early episodes that are no longer in regular rotation and later ones. Episodes featuring Jynx prominently were pulled from broadcast and have not been returned in most markets. An episode called The Ice Cave, in which Jynx played a significant role, was never broadcast outside Japan. Later episodes removed or minimized Jynx's appearances. The character has not been a significant presence in the anime since the early 2000s, and the games have been careful in how they have presented the redesigned purple version. What makes the Jynx case particularly interesting from a design history perspective is that the original design decision almost certainly was not made with any racist intent. The creature's design appears to draw from Japanese pop culture traditions around certain performance aesthetics, and the fact that it read as racially offensive to Western audiences while apparently not reading that way, in the original Japanese context illustrates how completely a visual language can carry different freight in different cultural environments. The redesign was necessary, and it was done. But the original character exists in the archive of the franchise's history as a reminder that design is never culturally neutral. The episode Cyber Soldier Porygon sits at the intersection of the franchise's biggest medical incident and its strangest ongoing character consequence, and its full history has already been described in this script. But there is a dimension of it worth returning to in this context. The episode was not pulled because its content was offensive. It was pulled because its animation technique caused a verifiable medical emergency. The response to that emergency included changes to animation practices across the entire Japanese industry. No other children's entertainment property has ever caused a change of that scope to the medium in which it was presented. The Porygon episode is the most consequential piece of animation in the history of Pokémon, and the creature itself, which did nothing wrong, and whose punishment is acknowledged as unfair by virtually everyone who knows the story, remains a strange monument to the randomness of blame in the aftermath of disaster. The controversy around Pokémon itself, as a cultural phenomenon, extended into religious and political territory in the late 1990s in ways that now seem almost quaint, but were quite intense at the time. Saudi Arabia banned the franchise in 2000 on grounds related to polytheism and gambling. Some Christian groups in the United States and Europe argued that Pokémon promoted occultism, evolution, or inappropriate spiritual concepts. There were parents who banned the games from their homes, church groups that held Pokémon card-burning events, and newsletters that circulated warnings about the franchise's supposed hidden influences on children. The irony of these concerns is that Pokémon's creator, Satoshi Tajiri, was not designing a spiritual or ideological product. He was designing a bug-collecting game. The evolution mechanics that some religious groups found objectionable were not intended as a commentary on Darwinian evolution, and the multiple Pokémon with spiritual or ghostly characteristics were drawn from Japanese folklore traditions that had no connection to the monotheistic frameworks those critics were applying. The collision between the franchise's Japanese cultural DNA and the interpretive frameworks of Western religious communities produced readings that Game Freak had not anticipated, and that the game's content does not support on careful examination. There was also the period following September 11th, 2001, when the American broadcast of the anime pulled or temporarily suspended several episodes. Tentacool and Tentacruel, which featured giant creatures destroying buildings in a coastal city, was removed because it now resembled a terrorist attack scenario in ways it had not before the attacks. The Tower of Terror episode was temporarily suspended because its title contained the word tower, in the immediate aftermath of the destruction of the World Trade Center's towers. Both episodes were eventually returned to the rotation, but the period of their suspension illustrates how the same content can become entirely different depending on the historical context in which it is consumed. Following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Tentacool and Tentacruel was pulled again. The episode, which features a city flooding and being destroyed by aquatic creatures, was considered too close to the imagery of the Katrina disaster to air comfortably. It is the only Pokémon episode to have been pulled from broadcast for two separate real-world events, years apart. The episode Battle of the Quaking Island, scheduled for broadcast in Japan in 2004, was never aired anywhere in the world. Its scheduled broadcast coincided with the 2004 Chuetsu earthquake in Niigata Prefecture, and the episode featured the Pokémon Whiscash causing earthquakes as a central plot element. Airing it in the weeks after a real earthquake that killed over 60 people was considered deeply inappropriate, and it was cancelled out of respect for the victims. As a consequence, the moves Earthquake, Fissure, and Magnitude have never been depicted in the Pokémon anime since the episode was pulled. These are common and important moves in the games, but they have been effectively banned from the anime's visual vocabulary for over 2 decades because of a single episode's proximity to a real disaster. There is a Sun and Moon episode involving Ash's face paint, which has already been discussed. There are the episodes involving Jinx that were removed when the character's redesign made earlier appearances too visually inconsistent to broadcast cleanly. There is a 2021 Journeys episode that was pulled from broadcast in South Korea due to its depiction of certain Japanese cultural elements, part of a long history of Korean sensitivity to the representation of Japanese culture in media following the colonial period. There are episodes that were removed in multiple countries for different reasons simultaneously, their absences creating slightly different gaps in the continuity depending on which country you grew up watching in. What the entire record of banned and controversial Pokémon episodes read together shows is not that the franchise is uniquely problematic. It shows that a franchise that has been running for 3 decades, producing content for children across almost every culture on Earth, will inevitably intersect with nearly every category of real-world sensitivity. The fact that the record is this long is partly a function of the franchise's longevity and global reach. Most entertainment properties never encountered this many different cultural contexts. Pokémon has been everywhere long enough to have collided with almost everything. The Pokémon Company's responses to these controversies have been, by the standards of large media companies, relatively thoughtful. The Jinx redesign was carried out. The epilepsy risk analysis led to genuine industry-wide changes. Episodes have been pulled or modified rather than defended when the defense would be incoherent. The franchise has not always gotten these decisions right, and there are choices it has made that remain debated. But the overall pattern suggests a company that has, more often than not, chosen adjustment over defensiveness when the evidence was clear. Section 10. The numbers behind the empire and the small things that made it. Let us talk about what Pokémon actually is in material terms, because the numbers are extraordinary enough that they deserve to be stated plainly in sequence so that the scope of what came from Satoshi Tajiri's insect collection can be properly appreciated. Pokémon is the highest-grossing media franchise of all time. As of 2024, it has generated an estimated $147 billion or more in total lifetime revenue. This exceeds every other media property in history. It exceeds Star Wars, it exceeds Marvel, it exceeds Disney's animated properties, it exceeds Harry Potter. The franchise that was born in a suburb of Tokyo, when a video game designer imagined insects crawling down a wire, has made more money than all of those things combined many times over. The video game series has sold more than 489 million units across more than 70 titles as of 2025. The original Pokémon Red and Blue remain the best-selling individual entries in the franchise, with over 31 million copies sold between them. Pokémon Sword and Shield, released in 2019 for the Nintendo Switch, sold over 25 million copies. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet sold more than 10 million copies in their first 3 days on sale, and over 20 million within their first year. 14 different Pokémon games have sold more than 10 million copies individually. The trading card game has sold over 75 billion cards since its launch in Japan in October 1996. This makes it the best-selling trading card game in history, surpassing Yu-Gi-Oh! A single card, the Pikachu Illustrator, sold for $16.5 million in February 2026, making it the most expensive trading card of any kind ever sold. The Pokémon anime has been watched by more than 1 billion viewers worldwide across its more than 1,300 episodes and 23 theatrical films. The franchise was the first video game property to appear on the cover of Time magazine in 1999. The small island nation of Niue issued legal tender featuring Pikachu in 2001, meaning that for a period of time, a cartoon mouse was printed on actual currency. And yet some of the most interesting things about Pokémon are not the large numbers, but the small ones. There were, at the time of the franchise's first games, exactly 151 Pokémon. The decision to use 151 rather than 150 was deliberate. Tajiri wanted the final number to be slightly unexpected, not a round hundred, not an even landmark, just 151, because it suggested that the world was already slightly larger than the container the game had been placed in. Mew, the 151st creature, was hidden, barely present, accessible only through a secret that almost no one in the development team knew about. The implication was that there was always one more thing in the world that you had not yet found. Today there are more than 1,000 Pokémon. The exact count changes with each new generation, and fans track it with the precision of a census. Scarlet and Violet, the 9th generation, pushed the total above 1,000, a milestone that was celebrated and mourned simultaneously by different portions of the fan community, celebrated because it reflected the franchise's growth, and mourned because it seemed to mark the end of the era, when you could know all of them, truly know all of them, in the way a child knows the members of a family or the names of the streets in their neighborhood. The diversity of the roster reflects an enormous range of design influences. There are Pokémon based on Japanese yokai, the supernatural creatures of Japanese folklore. There are Pokémon based on Welsh dragons and Norse mythology and Mesoamerican serpent gods. There are Pokémon based on household appliances, on circuit boards, on musical instruments, on pieces of garbage. There are Pokémon based on cell division, on protein structures, on quantum uncertainty principles. There are Pokémon that are sentient ice cream cones, which are either the most ridiculous design decision in the franchise's history, or a completely coherent extension of the logic that began with a rock pretending to be a tree, depending on how you look at it. The process by which new Pokémon are designed has changed over the franchise's history. Ken Sugimori no longer designs every creature personally. The design team has expanded dramatically, and the credits of modern Pokémon games list dozens of designers. The franchise has used designers from outside Japan, a milestone reached in 2010 when British designer James Turner became the first non-Japanese person to officially design Pokémon for the mainline series. Turner's designs tended toward the unusual and slightly unsettling. The Vanillite ice cream line, the Vullaby garbage bag vulture, the Guzzlord black hole dragon. They were immediately identifiable as coming from a different cultural aesthetic than the Japanese designs around them, and they added a dimension to the roster that it had not previously had. The competitive Pokémon scene, which has grown from informal schoolyard battles into a globally organized professional ecosystem with official world championships, has been shaped by mechanical details that the game's casual players are largely unaware of. Individual values, the hidden statistics that determine how high each Pokemon's stats will grow, were in the original games but undocumented and invisible to players. Stadium 2's stat display, which showed Pokemon's numbers in colorful bar charts, was many young players' first introduction to the concept that there was a layer of numerical reality beneath the surfaces of the creatures they had named and raised and cared for. The competitive scene built its entire infrastructure on those hidden numbers, and the Pokémon Company has increasingly acknowledged that infrastructure over the generations, eventually making IV and EV values visible and manipulable in the modern games. The friendship mechanic, introduced in Pokémon Yellow and formalized in Gold and Silver, was itself built on a small piece of fan feedback. Before Yellow was released, Game Freak received letters from children saying that they loved Pikachu exactly as it was and did not want it to evolve. The developers built Pikachu's resistance to evolution into the mechanics of the game in response, a direct translation of fan sentiment into functional design. That decision is partly why Pikachu remains the franchise's icon, rather than being a stepping stone to Raichu, which was the original design logic of its line. The most recognizable animated character in human history, in some measurements, exists as a mascot partly because a group of children wrote letters saying they loved it. The friendship evolution mechanic, which causes certain Pokémon to evolve when they have developed a sufficiently high friendship value with their trainer, was designed to reflect something Tajiri believed about the relationship between people and the creatures they cared for. He wanted the game to contain a real expression of the idea that the creatures rewarded emotional investment, that if you carried them and used them and healed them and spent time with them, something changed between you and them. The mechanic is almost invisible in normal play. Most players trigger friendship evolutions without understanding exactly what caused them, but the mechanic is there, in the code, recording every step you take, every potion you use, every time you let a creature faint without immediate recovery. It is a system for measuring care hidden inside a children's game. There is a mechanical detail in Gold and Silver that almost did not survive the development process. The real-time clock, the feature that meant the game world shifted through morning, afternoon, and evening, that different Pokémon appeared at different times of day, that certain events could only happen on specific days of the week was almost cut. The technical challenge of storing multiple color palette dyes for every map in the game, across every time of day, was pushing the Game Boy Color cartridge's memory capacity past its limits. Satoru Iwata, who was then at Nintendo and would later become its president, personally intervened to help the Game Freak team compress the code more efficiently. He was not a Game Freak employee. He had no obligation to help. But he worked through the problem with them until the real-time clock could fit, and then he made sure Kanto could fit too, and the result was a game with twice the world and 3 times the depth of anything the franchise had produced before. The legacy of that decision extends well beyond Gold and Silver. The real-time clock influenced how later franchises thought about simulated time, including Animal Crossing, which built its entire world around the same real-time calendar approach. The idea that a video game could be experienced differently depending on when in the actual day you played it, that the world you entered through a cartridge had its own relationship with the sun, was not obvious before Gold and Silver demonstrated it. It became obvious after. And that is, perhaps, the most consistent quality of the Pokémon franchise across its 30 years. Things that seem obvious now were not obvious before someone thought of them. The link cable trading mechanic, the friendship system, the day and night cycle, the type advantage matrix that made every battle a puzzle of competing weaknesses, the shiny Pokémon system, born from a programmer discovering they could flip color data without using extra memory, the missing no glitch, born from a developer who decided to fill empty memory slots with placeholder data rather than leaving them blank. The truck near the SSN, born from a designer who put a piece of ambient scenery in a corner of the map and never imagined it would become the most famous truck in the history of children's entertainment. Small decisions, invisible decisions, decisions made at 2 in the morning in a small studio in Tokyo by people who were not sure the game would ever ship, let alone change the world. They changed the world anyway. The Kubone wears its mother's skull. Yamask carries its human face and mourns it. Gengar might be Clefable's shadow, watching from the other side of a mirror. Ditto might be a failed attempt to recreate something perfect. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town was filled with grief long before anyone told ghost stories about the music. And somewhere in the code of a 30-year-old cartridge, a truck sits beside a pier, doing nothing, meaning everything. There are more than 1,000 Pokémon now, more than 500 episodes of the anime, more than 100 million children who grew up knowing these creatures as intimately as they knew the members of their own families. There are card collectors who paid millions of dollars for a single piece of printed cardboard. There are programmers who have spent decades reverse engineering games to find things that were never meant to be found. There are parents who played the original games as children and are now playing the new ones with children of their own, which means the franchise has lived long enough to become something that connects generations in the way that only the oldest and most essential stories can. It all came from a boy who missed the insects. That is the last fact. It is the most important one. Thank you so much for spending this time drifting through the world of Pokémon with me. If you made it this far, even just half asleep with your phone on the pillow beside you, I hope some small part of these stories found a comfortable place in your mind to rest. If you enjoyed this video and want more long-form Pokémon history and lore, please consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you know. And leaves a like if this helped you wind down. Drop a comment below telling me which fact surprised you most, or just tell me where in the world you are listening from. I read every single one. Now rest. The fields are full of things you have not yet found. You can look for them tomorrow. End of script section 11. The music of Pokémon. Junichi Masuda and the sounds that defined a generation. There is a moment in almost every person's relationship with Pokémon where a piece of music surfaces unbidden in memory, years after they last played the game that contained it, years after they consciously thought about that world at all. It might be the Route 1 theme from Red and Blue, that cycling melody that sits somewhere between adventure and safety, suggesting open roads and possibilities that are still manageable. It might be the Gold and Silver opening, or the Goldenrod City theme, with its warmth and its subtle complexity, suggesting a city that has a history and a mood beyond its function as a hub. It might be the Lance Battle theme or the Elite Four corridor music, or the town that plays when you have left home for the last time, and the world has just become much larger than you expected. The music remembers you even when you have stopped remembering it. Junichi Masuda composed the music for the original Pokémon Red and Green in 1996, working on hardware that gave him, by modern standards, essentially nothing to work with. The Game Boy's sound chip produced sound through 4 channels: 2 square waves, 1 wave channel, and 1 noise channel. 4 simultaneous sounds. That is the entire palette. No dynamic range, no orchestration, no production values in any conventional sense. What it had was precision and constraint, and those two things together often produce more interesting work than unlimited resources do, because they force the composer to consider what is essential and to find ways of expressing emotional states using minimal material. The Poke Center theme is a perfect example of what Masuda achieved within those constraints. It is a short loop, designed to be heard repeatedly without becoming irritating, but it accomplishes something that goes beyond mere inoffensiveness. It communicates safety, rest, the particular quality of a place where whatever is wrong can be made right. Every Pokémon Center in every game uses a variation of it, and the continuity of that theme across the franchise's history means that the sound has accumulated 30 years of players associating it with recovery and relief. When Heart Gold and Soul Silver remixed it into a fuller arrangement, many players found themselves unexpectedly moved. Not by the technical quality of the new version, but by the recognition of something they had been hearing since childhood. The Lavender Town theme's creation was described by Masuda in terms that suggest it was a deliberate attempt to write something unsettling. He wanted the music to reflect a place where the primary occupants were not human, where human values and human comforts were secondary to something else. He achieved this not through dramatic horror techniques, but through choice of intervals and the specific way the melody does not resolve in the way that trained Western ears expect. It keeps pulling toward a resolution and then not quite arriving there, which produces a very specific kind of unease that is difficult to consciously identify but immediately felt. The composer of the Gold and Silver soundtrack, working on essentially the same hardware but with a more mature command of it, produced what many consider the franchise's most musically accomplished early work. The gym leader battle theme from those games has a percussive drive that the original's gym themes lacked. The encounter theme for Ho-Oh and Lugia carries a weight that the sparse sound chip has no technical right to produce, but does anyway, through the specific weight of the intervals chosen and the way the theme announces itself with a kind of grandeur that was completely new for the franchise. The Ecruteak City theme, with its distinctive Asian-influenced melodic contour, is among the most beautiful pieces of music the franchise has produced in any generation, and it was created on 4 channels in 1999. As the franchise moved to more powerful hardware, the music expanded to take advantage of it. Diamond and Pearl introduced fully orchestrated arrangements. The battle music for the champion, Cynthia, became one of the most recognizable pieces of video game music in its generation, beloved not just by Pokémon fans but by anyone who encountered it. The Gen 5 games had perhaps the most musically ambitious soundtrack of the mainline series, with a composer who was clearly working through a specific set of ideas about what electronic and orchestral elements could do together within the constraints of a children's handheld game. The Black City theme, the Dragon Spiral Tower music, the climactic Ends Castle battle theme, which arrived after hours of building toward a philosophical confrontation and had to carry the emotional weight of everything the game had been saying about the ethics of catching and training creatures. It did. The Go Game soundtrack, by its nature in a mobile environment, had none of these constraints and benefited from it in some ways and lost something in others. The music that plays in the main menu of Pokémon Go carries none of the spatial specificity that the mainline game's town and route themes had. There is no auditory equivalent of Route 1 in Go, no melody that makes you feel like you have arrived somewhere specific and recognizable. The music is pleasant, ambient electronic production, not bad by any measure, but not the specific kind of good that the Game Boy tracks were. The constraint had been the ingredient all along. Junichi Masuda eventually became the director of the mainline series after Tajiri stepped back, directing from Fire Red and Leaf Green through Sword and Shield. As a composer who became a director, he brought specific sensibilities to the games he led, including a continuing emphasis on the music as a carrier of emotional information. He gave interviews discussing how the entire game world of each title was conceived in terms of what mood and atmosphere it should produce, and how the music was part of that conception from the earliest stages of development. This is not how most video game production works, where music is typically added late in the process to existing visual and design work. Masuda built the worlds around the music as much as the music around the worlds. The Gym Leader Defeat fanfare is perhaps the simplest piece of Pokémon music and among the most perfect. It is 4 seconds long. It plays every time the player defeats a gym leader, every time a journey's milestone is reached, every time the game acknowledges that something significant has been accomplished. It is the same 4 seconds that played the first time in 1996, and that has played in every generation since, sometimes in new arrangements, but always recognizably itself. 30 years of children have heard it at their first victory. It marks every beginning. Section 12. Ash Ketchum's Strange and Complete Journey. Journey. Ash Ketchum existed in the Pokémon anime for exactly 25 years, from 1997 to 2023, before the show finally allowed him to do the thing it had been preventing him from doing since the very first episode. Become the very best, like no one ever was. The announcement that the anime was ending Ash's story was met, depending on who you asked, with relief, grief, nostalgia, and a set of reflections on the nature of a character who had been deliberately frozen in time while the world around him kept changing. Ash was 10 years old for 25 years. Not metaphorically. The games are set in a world where 10-year-old children leave home alone to travel the wilderness and battle other children. And the anime took that premise and committed to it with a consistency that gradually became one of its strangest qualities. Ash never aged in any meaningful sense. He never graduated from anything. He started at 10, and he remained at approximately 10 for a generation of viewers who grew from the same age as him into adults with careers and families while he was still waking up late for his first morning as a Pokémon trainer. The original plan for Ash, according to production documents and interviews with early staff, was significantly grimmer in its conception of failure. He was supposed to lose the Indigo League, and the scripts that were written for a Ash victory were drafted and then discarded when executives decided that winning too early would rob the show of its forward momentum. The loss to Richie, which generated a response from viewers that can only be described as collective heartbreak, was a late production decision. It defined the next 20 years of the character's story. Always close, never quite there, accumulating wisdom and partnerships and battles that seemed to lead somewhere while the final destination kept retreating. The companions who traveled with Ash were, each of them, the result of arguments and negotiations and audience feedback. Misty stayed because fans loved her. Brock stayed because fans loved him. Tracy left because fans did not love him with the same intensity. May arrived for the Hoenn arc and found her own devoted audience. Dawn, Max, Iris, Silence, Serena, Lana, Kiawe, Go, each of them entered and left the narrative through a combination of story design and real-world reception data that the production team was always measuring and responding to. Serena's story arc in the XY series introduced something the show had always implied but rarely stated: the possibility that Ash had a reciprocated romantic relationship. Serena had known Ash in childhood, had specifically sought him out, and the final moment between them in the Kalos arc, in which Serena appeared to kiss Ash before boarding a train, generated a level of reaction from the audience that no Pokémon anime moment had produced in years. Whether it was actually a kiss was ambiguous enough that the production team could respond to questions about it in whatever way suited the moment, which they did with their characteristic obliqueness. Ash's departure from the show in 2023 was handled with genuine emotional care. He became the world champion, winning the final battle that validated everything his decades of effort had pointed toward. And then the show let him go home. He visited the people who had traveled with him. He sat with Pikachu in a field and watched the sunrise. The show gave him, in its final moments, something it had withheld for 25 years: completion. And the response from the audience was almost uniformly tender, because whatever reservations people had about his perpetual stasis or the show's repetitive structure, nobody wanted to see him fail at the end. He had been with them for too long. He had been 10 years old for too many of their own years. The new protagonists, Liko and Roy, who took over in Pokémon Horizons, had a different structural logic from Ash. They aged, they changed. The show acknowledged the passage of time in ways that Ash's story had systematically prevented. Whether this represents a maturation of the franchise's approach to its own narrative or simply a different kind of reset, the way the anime has always used generational transitions remains to be seen as their stories develop. Pikachu's voice actress, Ikue Otani, has voiced the character continuously since 1997. This means she has delivered the same creature's vocalization, essentially variations on the syllable Pika, for nearly 30 years. She has been Pikachu in every episode, every film, every short, every special, every promotional piece of content the anime has generated across its entire lifespan. She is in her early 50s now, and she has spent more than half of her life being the most recognizable animated creature's voice. At the 2023 wrap-up for Ash's story, she was visibly emotional in the production interviews, which is understandable. Something she had been doing since 1997 had ended. Section 13. The Pokémon Go phenomenon and the summer that changed everything. On July 6, 2016, Pokémon Go launched in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. By July 13th, it had been downloaded more than 30 million times. By the end of July, it was the fastest mobile game ever to reach 100 million downloads. People were walking into traffic. They were trespassing into churches and military bases and private property. They were gathering in parks at 2 in the morning in groups so large that the Wi-Fi in their neighborhoods was collapsing under the load. Hospitals were finding patients sneaking out of their rooms to chase Pokémon in the parking lot. Workers were being disciplined for playing the game during meetings. A man in Oregon discovered a dead body while looking for a water-type Pokémon near a river, which became one of the more surreal news stories of a year that was full of them. The concept behind the game was simple enough. Augmented reality combined with the Pokémon franchise's collecting mechanic translated into real-world movement. You walk to find Pokémon. You walk to hatch eggs. You walk to reach stops and gyms. The entire design philosophy was built around the premise that the game should pull people out of their houses and into the world, which was a reversal of everything video games had spent their existence doing. It worked almost too well. The game was developed by Niantic, a company that had spun out of Google and had previously made a similar augmented reality product called Ingress. The relationship between Niantic and the Pokémon company had been developing for several years before the launch, but the scale of the response was something that neither party had fully anticipated. The server infrastructure collapsed under the load repeatedly in the first weeks of release. Features that had been planned for launch, including the social trading mechanic that was central to the franchise's original design philosophy, had to be delayed. The servers were simply not equipped for what hundreds of millions of simultaneous users looked like. One of the most striking things about the summer of 2016 was who was playing. Surveys and usage data suggested that the demographic was unusually broad. Children played alongside parents who had grown up with the original games, alongside grandparents who had never played a video game before but found the walking and the collecting combination immediately comprehensible. The game became a social bridge in a way that no gaming product had previously achieved, partly because it was free, partly because it was on every smartphone, and partly because its simple premise was approachable for people who would have found a traditional Pokémon game overwhelming. There was a moment in the early weeks of the game's life that was widely photographed and written about. People gathering in Central Park in New York City in the middle of the night because a rare Pokémon, a Vaporeon, had appeared there. The images of hundreds of people running through the park in the dark, all of them looking at their phones, all of them running in the same direction, all of them participating in something simultaneously individual and communal, captured something very specific about the cultural moment the game had produced. It was strange and funny and genuinely touching in equal measure. The game eventually stabilized, added its missing features, built a robust competitive system around its raid mechanics, and became a persistent background fixture in the lives of tens of millions of players who never stopped playing it. By 2024, Pokémon Go had generated more than $9 billion in lifetime revenue, making it one of the highest-grossing mobile games in history, despite the fact that it was based on intellectual property that had already been generating billions for 2 decades before it launched. There is a detail in the early development of Pokémon Go that was revealed after launch. The original concept included a mechanic in which wild Pokémon could flee into the real world around you, meaning that if a Pokémon escaped a failed capture attempt, it would appear at a different real-world location, and you would need to physically move to find it again. The mechanic was cut because the safety implications were immediately obvious. Children would run into streets, into traffic, into dangerous locations, chasing creatures that were designed to be just out of reach. The decision to remove it was one of the most consequential, safety-first design choices in mobile game history, and it was made before a single user had ever touched the product. Section 14. Pokémon and the question of what a creature is. There is a philosophical current running beneath the entire Pokémon franchise that its creators have never fully articulated and its players have never fully resolved, and it concerns the nature of the creatures themselves. What are they? What do they experience? What does it mean to catch them, contain them in a capsule, use them to fight other creatures, trade them like objects? The games have always been somewhat evasive about this. The Pokédex entries describe Pokémon as having rich inner lives, complex emotions, strong bonds, and memories and preferences. Cubone grieves. Gengar delights in frightening humans. Gardevoir creates singularities to protect its trainer. Lucario can read the emotions of every living thing within a certain radius. These are not descriptions of animals. They are descriptions of persons, in the philosophical sense, beings with subjective experience and the capacity for genuine relationships. And yet the game mechanics treat them as instruments. You catch them. You release them. You deposit them in a storage system that holds thousands of creatures simultaneously, sorted by type or level or usefulness to your current goals. You use them to fight and then put them away. There is a tension between what the lore says Pokémon are and what the gameplay asks you to do with them, and the franchise has never resolved it. Instead, it has occasionally made the tension explicit in ways that are quite striking for a children's property. Pokémon Black and White built an entire narrative arc around this tension. The antagonist N was not trying to dominate the world or obtain a legendary Pokémon for power. He was arguing with genuine moral seriousness that humans should release their Pokémon and let them live free because the relationship between trainer and Pokémon was inherently exploitative. The games put considerable effort into making N's argument coherent. Some of the gym leaders in the game were written to have genuine doubts about their own practices, expressing uncertainty about whether competitive training was ethical. Early drafts of the game's script, according to various design documents that surfaced over the years, made N's position significantly more persuasive. Several gym leaders were written to agree with him, which would have fundamentally disrupted the game's structure and forced the player into a world where the Pokémon gym system was destabilizing. These elements were softened before release, pulling the game back from its most challenging philosophical implications. But enough remained that Black and White became the most morally complex mainline Pokémon game ever made, and N became one of the most discussed non-player characters in the franchise's history. The design of later games continued to push at this question from different angles. The Alola games in Sun and Moon had the protagonist releasing certain Pokémon back into the wild as a central narrative act. Legends. Arceus was set in a historical period when humans and Pokémon did not yet have the partnership structure of the modern games, and the game's entire design philosophy was built around earning trust rather than catching and commanding. The wild area of Sword and Shield showed Pokémon living in ecosystems with their own dynamics, independent of human interaction. The franchise has been slowly, across generations, complicating its own premise. And yet it remains, at its core, a game about collection, about filling boxes, about completing rosters and trading duplicates and seeking the rarest iterations of creatures you already own. The completionist drive that the original design encoded has never been walked back because it is the structural engine of everything. You gotta catch them all. The franchise's own marketing slogan stated it as an imperative, and 30 years of players have taken it as one. What is interesting is that the philosophical tension does not undermine the emotional experience. Players form genuine attachments to individual Pokémon, name them, carry them through entire games, feel grief when they faint or are accidentally released. The care system is real even though the capture system is ethically unexamined. The game creates the conditions for real feeling within a premise it never fully interrogates, and perhaps that is why it has lasted as long as it has. It gives you something beautiful to hold without asking you to think too hard about the hand that holds it. There is a detail in the Pokédex entry for Alakazam that is worth sitting with. Alakazam is described as having an IQ of 5,000, a memory that spans its entire lifespan from birth, and a brain that continues growing throughout its life. It is, by the game's own description, significantly more intelligent than any human being who has ever lived. And yet in the world of Pokémon, an Alakazam can be caught, contained, traded, and commanded by a 10-year-old child. The game does not comment on this. There is no character in any Pokémon game who looks at an Alakazam and asks whether what they are doing is appropriate. The question lives in the gap between what the Pokédex says and what the mechanics assume. Section 15. Small facts, strange facts, and the long tail of trivia. Here at the end of our journey, let us slow down further and let these smaller facts drift through like leaves on water. No themes, no through lines. Just the small and strange things that have accumulated in 30 years of the world's most documented franchise. The name Pokémon itself is an abbreviation. In Japanese it is Poketo Monsuta, which translates directly to pocket monster. The abbreviated form, Pokémon, was a design decision made because the full name is awkward in both Japanese and English, as a repeated element in dialogue and marketing. The pocket part of the name reflects the original design concept. Creatures small enough to fit in your pocket, stored in capsules you could carry with you. Tajiri's original name for the project was Capsule Monsters, and that name was changed for trademark reasons before development was complete. Marill was called Peekaboo in the Playground Rumor era for a reason that is traceable. Early promotional materials for the second generation showed Marill in some contexts that, to players who had only seen the primary types of the first generation, made it look like a blue Pikachu. The creature's round ears and round body, and the context in which it appeared, promotional materials for the film rather than game information, made the connection seem obvious to 10-year-old eyes. The actual creature, when it arrived, was a water-type mouse with no connection to Pikachu's evolutionary line. The confusion was entirely understandable given what players knew at the time. The move splash is named as it is in English because of a translation error from the Japanese. In Japanese, the move is called hanaru, which means to hop or to bounce, referring to Magikarp's frantic flopping movement rather than any interaction with water. The English localization team chose splash, presumably because Magikarp is a fish, and splashing seemed fish-related, but the choice created a permanent logical inconsistency in the English text, because Hoppip and other non-aquatic Pokémon can also learn the move. The inconsistency has been present in the English games since 1998 and has never been corrected, because correcting a move name in a long-running franchise creates its own set of consistency problems. In the original Gold and Silver games, a Pokémon's friendship value increases by a measurable amount every 256 steps the player takes. The game calculates friendship in intervals tied to step counts, and 256 steps is the smallest interval at which the increase happens. This means that players who are obsessively walking back and forth to raise their EV's friendship for an Espeon evolution were actually using the optimal strategy whether they knew it or not, simply by virtue of the fact that the most natural way to raise friendship, by walking, happened to align perfectly with the step count mechanics. In Pokémon Crystal, the first game in the series to feature animated sprites, the animations were so severely compressed to fit within the Game Boy Color's memory that each sprite animation runs for only a few frames. The decision to include them at all was nearly reversed midway through development, when the team calculated that storing even minimally animated versions of all Pokémon's sprites was going to exceed the cartridge's storage capacity. The solution was aggressive compression that stripped the animations down to their most essential movements. The result looks simple by any modern standard, but in 1999 it was extraordinary. Players who had only ever seen static sprites suddenly watched their Pokémon move. Slowpoke's tail is used as food in the world of the Pokémon games. The games establish that Slowpoke tails are a culinary delicacy, which is one of the stranger pieces of lore in the franchise if you follow its implications. The tails grow back after being bitten off by Shellder, and Team Rocket in the Gold and Silver arc is shown cutting Slowpoke tails for sale. This is depicted, correctly, as a form of cruelty, and stopping it is part of the player's early narrative motivation. But the broader implication that Slowpoke tails are also a food regularly eaten by the people of Johto, under circumstances that don't involve Team Rocket, has never been addressed with the same seriousness. The games contain a food ecosystem involving Pokémon body parts that is essentially never examined. The original gym leader order in Red and Blue was different from what shipped. Early design documents and beta materials suggest that the intended order of gym challenges was changed during development, with different gym leaders placed at different points in the journey than where they ended up in the final game. The specific changes are not fully documented, but data miners have found evidence suggesting that Blaine, the fire-type gym leader on Cinnabar Island, was originally placed much earlier in the game before being relocated to what became one of the final gym positions. The hidden machine, or HM system that required players to use specific moves in the field to advance through the game world, was a design decision that the franchise eventually walked away from entirely. Starting in Sun and Moon, Ride Pokémon replaced field moves, and subsequent games have moved further away from the HM concept. The reason the original games required HMs was that the overworld was designed with physical obstacles that the player needed specific Pokémon abilities to overcome, which tied the game's exploration structure to the game's battle mechanics in a way that felt thematically coherent. Players needed Pokémon with cut to reach certain areas, Pokémon with surf to cross water, Pokémon with strength to move boulders. The problem was that this required players to carry Pokémon specifically for field utility rather than for battle strength, which became increasingly onerous as the game expanded. The solution of Pokémon that exist in the world as transportation removed this problem while preserving the visual logic of creatures helping humans navigate. The Pokémon franchise has had precisely one prominent human death that is directly stated in the narrative of the mainline games. In Gold and Silver, the tower in Ecruteak City, the Burned Tower, was once a grand building that burned down in a fire. 3 Pokémon were caught in the fire and died there. Those 3 Pokémon became Ho-Oh's companions after Ho-Oh resurrected them, and they are the 3 legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. The question of what 3 Pokémon the tower contained originally, which species gave rise to which legendary beast, has never been officially answered. Fan theories have proposed many correspondences, the most popular being that a Flareon became Entei, a Jolteon became Raikou, and a Vaporeon became Suicune based on the elemental alignment. But it has never been confirmed, and the mystery has been deliberately preserved for nearly 30 years. There is a detail about the Indigo League Elite Four in the original games that many players noticed, but perhaps fewer thought through fully. The Elite Four members are presented in a sequence, and by the end of the game's main story, most players will have defeated each of them. But there is a question implicit in the game world. What happens to the Elite Four when someone beats them? Are they replaced? Do they remain in their positions? Do they leave? The games never establish this clearly. The Elite Four is simply there, a set of tests standing between the player and the champion, and their existence as characters beyond that function is barely sketched. They have names and type specializations and dialogue, and that is approximately the full extent of their personhood within the game's fiction. Norman, the 5th gym leader in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, is the player character's father. This is the first and only time in the main series of games that you encounter your protagonist's father. And the game handles the encounter with a specific low-key awkwardness that feels genuine. He is your father, but he is also a gym leader, and within the context of the game, he must be both of those things simultaneously, which means he has to treat you somewhat formally in his professional role while also being your parent. You battle him. You defeat him. He gives you a HM and says he is proud of you. It is, in a small way, a poignant moment, and the fact that every other game in the franchise pointedly avoids giving the protagonist a father suggests that the developers recognized they had done something interesting with Norman and were not sure how to repeat it. There are Pokémon games that have never been released outside Japan. Pokémon card game GB2, the sequel to the Game Boy Color card game title, was released in Japan in 2000 and has never received an official English translation. Pokémon Green, the original Japanese release that preceded Red, was not localized for Western markets, which received Red and Blue instead, making Green a game that exists for a significant fraction of the franchise's global audience only in the form of ROM translations and emulation. The complete list of Japan-exclusive Pokémon media is extensive enough that there is an entire category of fandom dedicated to it. People who play and document the games that were made for Japan and never sent anywhere else. The Pokethlon, a minigame section introduced in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, used an entirely different set of statistics from the main battle system, measuring attributes like speed and stamina and jumping, rather than the combat stats of HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. The idea that Pokémon had athletic dimensions separate from their battle capabilities was a small expansion of the fiction's logic, suggesting that the creatures existed in a fuller sense within their world, with bodies that did things outside of fighting. It was a minor feature that most players spent little time with, but its philosophical implication, that Pokémon were athletes as well as combatants, that they had physical lives beyond what was useful in battle, contributed quietly to the world's sense of depth. The Pokeroos, a mysterious virus that can infect Pokémon in the games and doubles the rate at which they gain effort values from battles, is described in the games as extremely rare, rarer than finding a shiny Pokémon. When it was first discovered by players in Gold and Silver, it caused genuine alarm because a game informing you that your Pokémon had contracted a virus felt like bad news rather than good. The name, a portmanteau of Pokémon and virus, did not help. Players shared information frantically about whether they should be concerned, and only gradually did the community establish that Pokerus was entirely beneficial, not harmful, and that spreading it to your other Pokémon was desirable. It is one of the few pieces of the game's terminology that was unambiguously poorly chosen, generating panic about something that should have generated celebration. The Safari Zone's step counter, which in the original games allowed players a fixed number of steps before they were expelled from the area regardless of progress, was redesigned in Heart Gold and Soul Silver into a time-based system. The redesigned Safari Zone also allowed players to attract specific Pokémon to specific areas by placing certain items there and waiting a specific amount of real-world time, sometimes days, for the Pokémon to appear. This was almost certainly the most patient thing the franchise had ever asked of its players, requiring them to come back to a specific in-game location on a specific day, having set it up days earlier to check whether the Pokémon they were seeking had decided to appear. And perhaps that is the best note to end on, the patient thing. The franchise asks patience in a dozen different ways. It asks you to walk 256 steps, to come back on Tuesday because the contest only happens on Tuesday, to wait until night for the Pokémon that only appear at night, to hatch an egg by walking, to raise your Pokémon's friendship slowly over the course of a whole journey until the bond between you is strong enough to trigger a change. Pokémon is beneath the surface of its collecting and battling mechanics, a game about taking time with things, about being present with something small and letting it grow, about the patience of a boy in rubber boots at the edge of a shallow stream, watching and waiting and noticing what is there. Sleep well. The fields are full of things you have not yet found. Section 16. The people who made the world. Designers, composers, writers, and unsung architects. A franchise as large as Pokémon does not emerge from a single mind. Satoshi Tajiri conceived it, and his vision shaped its fundamental character. But the world he imagined could only be built by dozens of people whose names most fans have never learned, each of them contributing something without which the final product would have been meaningfully less. Understanding some of those contributions adds a dimension to the experience of playing these games that is difficult to describe, but immediately felt once you have it. Ken Sugimori's visual language is so thoroughly embedded in what Pokémon looks like that it has become invisible. The design sensibility he brought to the original 151 creatures, a combination of clean linework, strong silhouettes, and what might best be described as a warm strangeness, established an aesthetic that the franchise has been working within, and sometimes against ever since. Sugimori was trained as a manga artist, and the manga tradition's emphasis on legibility at small sizes and expressiveness through simplified features shaped how each Pokémon was designed to read. In the Game Boy's tiny sprite format, a design needed to communicate its essential character in approximately 56 by 56 pixels. That constraint forced clarity. A Gengar is a grinning purple blob, but that grin carries everything you need to know about what Gengar is. Sugimori's early watercolor artwork, the painted illustrations that accompanied the original games and became the basis for the trading card art, has aged in a way that no subsequent Pokémon art has quite managed. There is a warmth and a slight imprecision in watercolor that gives the original art a living quality, a sense that the creatures in it exist in a world with atmosphere and depth, rather than the flat digital cleanliness of later official art. The 2009 Japanese book Satoshi Tajiri, A Man Who Created Pokémon, reproduced some of those early Ken Sugimori sketches in watercolors, and fans who have seen them describe the experience of looking at them as something different from looking at any other Pokémon art. They feel like windows rather than images. The first non-Japanese Pokémon designer in the mainline series was James Turner, a British graphic designer who joined Game Freak in 2010. His designs carry a visual DNA that is immediately distinguishable from the Japanese designers around him, not worse or better, but genuinely different in character. Trevenant, his ghost and grass tree Pokémon, has a melancholy that goes beyond its type combination. Buzzwole, his ultra beast, is a bodybuilder made entirely of veins and muscles, which is either deeply strange or exactly right for a creature from another dimension. depending on how much credit you want to give to the design's conceptual coherence. Guzzlord, his Black Void Dragon Ultra Beast, uses negative space in a way that most Pokémon designs avoid, built around an enormous mouth that is essentially an absence at its center. Hironobu Yoshida has been at Game Freak since the Yellow Era and is responsible for a list of designs that spans multiple generations. Wobbuffet, the passive resistance Pokémon who cannot initiate attacks. Celebi, the time-traveling forest spirit. Deoxys, the DNA Pokémon whose multiple forms reflect its extraterrestrial origin. Wobbuffet's design philosophy, a creature that exists entirely in response to what others do to it rather than having its own offensive initiative, is one of the most philosophically coherent Pokémon in the franchise and reflects a specific and unusual creative choice. The trading card game's illustrators have produced some of the franchise's most striking visual art, largely under conditions of tight deadlines and strict style guidelines. The cards that have acquired collector significance beyond their gameplay value are almost always distinguished by illustration quality, and several illustrators have developed dedicated followings among card collectors who seek out their specific work. The Ken Sugimori illustrated cards, which directly connect to the franchise's founding, carry a particular weight. The Atsuko Nishida illustrated Pikachu Illustrator card, which has been sold for prices that make it one of the most valuable pieces of entertainment art in history, represents the intersection of two threads of Pokémon's creative genealogy: the original designer and the foundational character. The writers of the anime have worked largely without recognition, their names appearing in credits that most viewers skip. But specific decisions made in specific episode scripts have shaped how hundreds of millions of people think about the franchise. The writer who decided that Ash should lose to Richie in the Indigo League changed the entire structure of what followed. The writer who gave Meowth his backstory, explaining how he had learned to speak because he loved a female Meowth who was impressed by humans, gave the franchise its most emotionally resonant character beyond the main cast. The writer who drafted the Bye Bye Butterfree episode, in which Ash releases one of his first Pokémon companions into the wild with a mate, established a template for bittersweet farewells that the franchise has returned to repeatedly and that players and viewers rank among its most emotionally significant moments. There are writers whose work lives only in the games, in the Pokédex entries that most players scroll past without reading. These entries, some of them harrowing and some beautiful and some both simultaneously, are the franchise's most concentrated pieces of creative writing, typically only 2 or 3 sentences that must establish a creature's entire mythology while also functioning as a gameplay data display. The entry for Banette in the 3rd generation describes a puppet Pokémon whose entire existence is defined by its abandonment. It was a child's toy that was thrown away, and the resentment of that rejection transformed it into a ghost that now seeks out the child who discarded it. In 2 sentences, a tragedy. The writer whose name is not in any credit block wrote one of the saddest things in the franchise. The localization teams who translated the games for Western audiences made choices that shaped how entire generations of players understood the world. Some of those choices were improvements on the original Japanese text. Some were simplifications that lost nuance. Some introduced new details or connotations that the original did not contain. The team that named Magikarp and Gyarados preserved the mythological association while making it legible to English speakers. The team that translated the Pokédex entries sometimes faced impossible compression challenges, fitting several sentences of Japanese mythology into the same character count that English syntax required. The games that English speakers played are, in many ways, different games from the ones Japanese speakers played, and the cumulative effect of all those translation decisions is a version of Pokémon that has its own distinct texture. There is a Game Freak developer named Shigeki Morimoto, who has been with the studio since the first games and who is responsible for, among other things, hiding Mew in the game 2 weeks before it shipped. Morimoto appears as a non-player character in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver games, where he can be found in the lobby of a hotel in Celadon City and will offer the player a free Pokémon. This is the franchise's way of acknowledging his contribution with a small and private joke. The man who put a secret Pokémon in the game, who created the practice of hiding things for players to find, is himself a hidden thing in the game. You have to know where to look. There is something beautiful about that, and it is continuous with the franchise's best tradition. The people who made the world put pieces of themselves inside it, in places that are easy to miss and exactly the right size to fit the people who notice them. The whole franchise is full of this kind of thing. The names Satoshi and Shigeru in the original games. The developers who appear as in-game characters. The music that has Masuda's fingerprints on it, even when it is performed by someone else. The design language that still looks like Sugimori, even when the actual designer is someone who wasn't born when the first games were made. The world is full of people who put themselves into things so that those things would last. Pokémon has lasted 30 years. In 30 more years, some of those people will be gone, and their contributions will be embedded in a world that billions of people will still be visiting. That is not a small thing to have done. Section 17. Regional forms, mega evolutions, and the franchise's expanding logic. Pokémon has always expanded its vocabulary when it needed to. The introduction of new types, the addition of breeding mechanics, the discovery of held items and abilities, each of these represented the franchise reaching for a new conceptual tool to keep the world feeling alive and internally consistent. Some of these expansions were more successful than others, and the history of which expansions stuck and which were quietly walked back is a record of the franchise's attempts to understand its own rules. Mega Evolution, introduced in Pokémon X and Y in 2013, was the franchise's most dramatic visual expansion since the introduction of shiny Pokémon. The concept was simple in its surface presentation. Certain Pokémon could temporarily transform into enhanced forms during battle, gaining new abilities, dramatically altered stats, and in some cases, entirely new type combinations. The visual transformations were often striking. Mega Charizard X became black-scaled and blue-flamed. Mega Mewtwo Y became a floating psychic entity with a grotesquely enlarged cranium. Mega Gardevoir's gown expanded into an enormous white bell shape. The early concept for Mega Evolution was that it would be permanent. The original design documents showed megaforms as final evolutions rather than temporary transformations, which would have changed the franchise's design logic fundamentally by creating new apex forms for creatures that had already reached their final evolution. The decision to make them temporary was made to preserve balance, because permanent megaforms would have made pre-megaforms obsolete in a way the developers found uncomfortable. The temporary version, activated once per battle through a held item called a Megastone, preserved the original Pokémon's identity while adding dramatic tension around the choice of when to activate the transformation. Mega Evolution appeared in X, Y, and the Generation 6 remakes, then disappeared. It returned in brief form in games from later generations, but was effectively replaced as the headline mechanic of each successive generation. Z moves in Sun and Moon, Dynamax and Gigantamax in Sword and Shield, Terastallization in Scarlet and Violet. The pattern suggests a design philosophy in which each generation introduces a new combat transformation mechanic, provides it with its own visual and mechanical identity, and then mostly retires it as the series moves forward. Whether this represents a lack of confidence in any single mechanic, or a considered decision to keep each generation feeling distinct, the result is a franchise that has committed to and then de-emphasized several major systems over time. Regional forms, introduced in Sun and Moon as Alolan forms, and expanded with Galarian forms in Sword and Shield and Hisuian forms in Legends. Arceus, represent a more elegant kind of expansion. The concept is that Pokémon that have established themselves in specific environments over long periods of time have evolved differently from their original forms, adapting to local conditions in ways that produce new type combinations, new appearances, and new evolutionary possibilities. Alolan Vulpix is Ice-type rather than Fire-type because it settled in mountain environments and adapted to cold. Galarian Ponyta is Psychic and Fairy-type because the meadows it inhabits have magical properties that shaped its evolution. Hisuian Zorua is Normal and Ghost-type because the Zorua that once lived in ancient Hisui were driven out by humans who feared them, and died alone in the cold, transforming into revenants that now roam as ghost types. The Ghost Zorua detail is one of the franchise's most quietly affecting pieces of retrospective mythology. Zoro was introduced in Black and White as a dark-type trickster, a fox Pokémon that could disguise itself as other creatures to avoid conflict. The Hisuian form reveals a backstory for the species. There was a time when Zorua lived among humans, and were misunderstood and feared, and the community that was driven away and killed in the cold became something different, a ghost version of itself, still wearing the appearance of a normal Zorua, but now fundamentally transformed by death and grief. The regional form mechanic allowed the franchise to tell this story retrospectively without touching the main Zorua, which retained its original design and type classification. The regional form was a new story layered onto an existing Pokémon, adding depth without disruption. The paradox. Pokémon introduced in Scarlet and Violet took the regional form concept in a different direction, imagining ancient and future versions of existing Pokémon rather than regionally adapted ones. Ancient Donphan is a massive spiked rock beast. Future Donphan is a sleek, mechanical sphere. The same creature separated by thousands of years of evolution, given radically different forms by the environments of their respective eras. The mechanic allows the franchise to speculate about its own prehistory and futurity, to imagine what the world of Pokémon might have looked like before human civilization organized it, and what it might look like after technology has transformed everything. It is a conceptual expansion that has philosophical implications the games have so far only partially explored. The most discussed regional variant in terms of its lore implications is arguably Slowpoke. Galarian Slowpoke has no shelter attached to it and is instead described as having spicy particles from Galarian grain settled in its forehead horn, giving it a psychic typing from a completely different source than the waterborne Shelter interaction that produces standard Slowbro. The implication is that the same endpoint, a more psychically developed Slowpoke, can be reached through multiple pathways, that the specificity of the evolution mechanic in the mainline games is not a description of the only way things can happen, but one instance among many possible ones. The world, in other words, is more various than any specific game's mechanics can fully capture. And here, in the space between sleep and waking, let these last facts settle. The franchise has been running for 30 years. In those 30 years, it has made more money than any entertainment property in human history. It has employed hundreds of designers and composers and writers and programmers and translators. It has been played on every continent. It has been banned and celebrated and beloved and argued over and studied and memed and collected and bought and sold for sums of money that would have seemed delusional to anyone who encountered the original handheld game in 1996. It has changed the way children understand collecting and trading and partnership. It has changed the animation industry's safety standards. It has changed how people walk through cities, or at least for one summer it changed how 100 million of them did. None of this was planned. The plan was for a boy to make a bug-collecting game and see if anyone wanted to play it. The plan took 6 years and nearly bankrupted the company and required a mentor who took the project seriously when almost no one else would, and required a programmer to hide a secret creature in a memory slot 2 weeks before the game shipped. The plan was held together by the specific quality of attention that Satoshi Tajiri brought to everything he cared about, from the arcade boards he cataloged as a teenager to the insects he mapped as a child, the quality of someone who notices the details that other people walk past. The truck is still there, near the dock, doing nothing. Mew is in the game if you know where to look. The boy whose name became the main character's name has not given an interview in years. The creatures are still in their boxes, waiting, with all their hidden values and their silent friendship scores accumulating one step at a time. Go to sleep. The world you remember is still there. Thank you for spending these hours with us. If you are still here, drop a comment below with where you are in the world and what time it is there. I am always grateful to know. If this video helped you relax and rest, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of slow, long-form content reach more people who need it. And if there is a Pokémon topic you would like to fall asleep to next time, tell me in the comments. Good night. A final thought before you drift. There is something worth saying about why Pokémon works as a subject for falling asleep to. something that goes beyond the obvious comfort of familiar things. The franchise is structured around patience. The rarest Pokémon require the most waiting. The strongest bonds grow the slowest. The creatures that seem useless in the early game become something extraordinary if you carry them long enough. There is a rhythm to it that mirrors the rhythm of long, slow nights, where the mind moves through memory and association without urgency, where small things become interesting, where the fact that a game designer once misnamed a move because of a translation error is somehow as worth knowing as anything more consequential. The world of Pokémon is full of things that almost happened. The father who was never quite included in the story, the evolution that was cut, the episode that was banned before it aired, the mechanic that was designed and then removed because someone realized it might send a child running into a street. All of these almost things are part of the shape of what is. The gaps define the edges. The cuts show where the knife moved. And understanding that the world you love was built by people making decisions under pressure in small studios on hardware that barely worked, with no way of knowing whether any of it would matter, makes the thing they built feel more precious, not less. Sleep now. Tomorrow the root is still there and the Pokémon are still in the tall grass, and somewhere in a piece of code that has been running for 30 years, a creature is waiting to be found.